Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today, we're pulling the curtain back on a story of chemical warfare disguised as progress, of corporate greed wrapped in a flag, and of a poison that never went away. We're talking about Agent Orange. It was a global game of chicken, played not just with bombs and spies, but with molecules and profits, and the true history they don't want you to know is infinitely darker than the official narrative. This is a complex, heavy subject, a deep dive into the machinery of institutional denial. So, before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right, dim the lights. This one gets messy. The story doesn't begin in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. It doesn't start in a Pentagon war room or in the Oval Office. It begins in the quiet, sterile laboratories of the 1940s, in the minds of men who had just witnessed humanity harness the atom, and believed with an almost religious fervor that there was no problem science could not solve. The Second World War had been the ultimate catalyst, transforming chemistry from an academic pursuit into an engine of national power. The atom bomb was the terrifying crescendo, but a quieter revolution was happening in parallel, the mastery of organic chemistry. And in this new world, victory wouldn't just belong to the nation with the biggest armies, but to the one that could master the very building blocks of life itself. This was the alchemist's post-war dream, not turning lead into gold, but turning botany into a weapon. The initial research was, as it always is, framed as a miracle for humanity. Scientists at the University of Chicago and other institutions working under government contracts discovered the power of synthetic auxins, plant growth hormones. They found that specific compounds in small doses could stimulate plant growth, promising bigger yields, faster harvests, an end to world hunger. A miracle in a bottle. Two of these compounds were particularly effective: 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, or 2,4-D, and 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, or 2,4,5-T. In controlled low concentrations, they made plants grow. But in high concentrations, they made them grow uncontrollably, catastrophically, until they exhausted their own nutrients and died. They forced a plant to commit suicide. This discovery was a breakthrough for agriculture. A farmer could now spray a field and kill the broadleaf weeds without harming the grass family crops like corn or wheat. It was selective, efficient, and profitable. Companies like Dow Chemical and Monsanto, who had been instrumental in the wartime production of everything from napalm to synthetic rubber, immediately saw the commercial potential. The post-war boom was on, and chemistry was king. But the Pentagon saw something else. They saw the dual-use potential that lurks behind every great technological leap. If you can kill a weed, you can kill a crop. If you can kill a crop, you can starve an army. More importantly, in the burgeoning Cold War, if you could kill a jungle, you could expose an enemy that thrived in its shadows. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. The new face of conflict wasn't the trench warfare of Europe. It was the guerrilla insurgency, fought in impenetrable terrain where conventional forces were at a massive disadvantage. The jungle was not just the landscape. It was the enemy's greatest ally. It provided concealment, food, and strategic depth. So, the question in the minds of military planners became, what if we could simply remove the jungle? What if we could strip the earth bare and deny the enemy their sanctuary? This wasn't framed as an act of ecological destruction. It was presented as a surgical tool, a humane alternative to carpet bombing. It was a bloodless victory, won by chemists. This thinking is perfectly encapsulated in a memo that circulated within the Advanced Research Projects Agency in the late 1950s, a sentiment echoed in the private conversations between military procurement officers and chemical company executives. Uncomfortable. Quote, attributed to a senior chemist at Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Weapons Research Center, in a 1958 briefing. We are not discussing a weapon in the traditional sense. We are discussing a tool of environmental modification. The political sensitivities surrounding chemical warfare are irrelevant here. One cannot accuse us of gassing an enemy when we are merely accelerating a natural process. We are altering the flora, not targeting the fauna. It is an elegant solution. We make the landscape inhospitable, and the enemy simply leaves. The moral and legal obstacles fall away when you realize we are not fighting the man. We are fighting the trees that hide him. Altering the flora, not targeting the fauna. That was the lie they told themselves, the critical piece of self-deception that allowed the entire program to move forward. The idea that you could wage war on an ecosystem without waging war on the people who live within it is a fantasy, a dangerous and arrogant one, but it was the core of the sales pitch. The British had already experimented with this during the Malayan emergency, using 2,4,5T to destroy jungle gardens grown by communist insurgents. The results were promising enough for American observers to take extensive notes. The concept was proven. It just needed to be scaled up, industrialized, and perfected. And so, the alchemist's dream began its malignant transformation. The same scientists and corporations that were being celebrated on the covers of magazines for ushering in a new era of agricultural abundance were simultaneously signing classified contracts to turn that same science into an instrument of war. The promise to feed the world became a plan to starve an enemy. The molecular key designed to unlock nature's bounty was being refitted to scorch the earth. This is the foundational paradox of Agent Orange. Its birth was not the work of monsters in some secret lair, but of celebrated innovators and profit-driven corporations who saw a problem, jungle warfare, and offered a simple, elegant, and terrifyingly marketable solution. They promised a war without bullets and delivered a poison without end. The long-term consequences of this hubris, of believing you could wage a sterile war against nature itself, were not a consideration. They were an externality, a problem for another day, for other people to suffer. That problem, the one for other people on another day, was fast approaching. But before the first C-123 transport plane could lumber into the sky with its belly full of poison, the concept had to be laundered. It had to be stripped of its terrifying implications and repackaged as something reasonable, scientific, and even helpful. This vital work of strategic deception fell to the Pentagon's newest and most prestigious brain trust, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. Born from the panic of the Sputnik launch in 1958, ARPA was America's answer to the threat of falling behind. It was a place for brilliant minds and blank checks, a high-risk, high-reward incubator for the technologies that would define the rest of the 20th century. While NASA handled the public-facing space race, ARPA worked in the shadows on everything from ballistic missile defense to, eventually, the precursor to the Internet. And in 1961, as the Kennedy administration grew increasingly obsessed with the brushfire wars of the Third World, ARPA launched Project Agile. Its mission: to rapidly develop and deploy technologies for counterinsurgency, with a laser focus on the burgeoning conflict in South Vietnam. Project Agile was the perfect cover. It was a sprawling, multifaceted initiative, a grab bag of high-tech solutions for the messy problem of guerrilla warfare. Nestled among its proposals for lightweight body armor, long-range patrol radios, and infrared night vision scopes was a seemingly innocuous sub-project on vegetation control. This is how the benign mask was crafted. The defoliation program was not presented as a standalone chemical warfare initiative. It was buried deep within a respected, high-priority research program. It was just one of dozens of ideas being explored to give American allies an edge. The public narrative, and indeed the narrative fed to many within the government, was about modernizing the South Vietnamese military and helping them secure their own country. Under the umbrella of Agile, the early herbicide tests began, far from the public eye. Test sites were established at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, in the dense tropical forests of Puerto Rico, and, crucially, in allied countries. With the cooperation of the British, tests were conducted in Malaya and with the Thais along the border with Laos. The stated purpose was always plausible, always defensive. A 1961 ARPA report might speak of testing herbicides to improve visibility along transportation routes or to establish clear defensive perimeters around strategic hamlets. It sounded like groundskeeping on a grand scale. They were simply trying to keep the jungle at bay. Who could object to that? It was a technical problem, not a moral one. This careful framing was a masterclass in bureaucratic deceit. It allowed the program to build momentum, secure funding, and conduct years of research and development without ever having to face a serious public debate about its true nature. The scientists at Fort Detrick weren't developing a weapon. They were evaluating phytotoxic compounds. The Air Force wasn't preparing for chemical attacks, it was developing aerial liquid dissemination systems. Every stage of the process was cloaked in the sterile, passionless language of science and logistics. This methodical sanitization of language was crucial, as it allowed men who saw themselves as decent public servants to participate in the creation of a weapon of ecological devastation. The internal communications from this period reveal the strategy with chilling clarity. Classified memo. From the desk of an ARPA Deputy Director, Project Agile, March 1962. Subject: Proposed Field Evaluations, Republic of Vietnam, RVN. Further to our discussions with MAAG-FI, we have identified an immediate opportunity to conduct larger-scale field evaluations of several promising herbicidal formulations. The RVN government has expressed significant interest in collaborating on a project to clear key transportation arteries, specifically Highway 1 and the primary railway line, which are currently vulnerable to ambush due to jungle overgrowth. A successful demonstration would not only provide a tangible security benefit to our allies, but would also yield invaluable operational data on dissemination patterns in a tropical environment. The project can be publicly positioned as a joint U.S. RVN infrastructure modernization effort, emphasizing enhanced commerce and civilian safety. The secondary military utility, denial of cover to Viet Cong elements, need not be the primary point of emphasis in our external communications. Secondary military utility. There it is. The quiet part, said quietly. The real reason for the entire enterprise, relegated to a subordinate clause. This memo is the strategy in miniature. Sell it as infrastructure, sell it as safety, sell it as helping our allies manage their unruly vegetation. But everyone who needed to know understood the real purpose, and the corporate partners, Dow, Monsanto, and the others, were more than happy to play their part. They were supplying a commercial product, an herbicide, for a government contract. In their view, what the government chose to do with that product was not their concern. They were merely fulfilling an order for a chemical that was, at the time, legally sold for agricultural use inside the United States. This gave them the legal and moral firewall they would hide behind for the next 50 years. The meta-commentary here writes itself, but it must be stated plainly. The moment you create a system that allows you to call a chemical weapon an herbicide, you have already lost the moral plot. The bureaucratic detoxification of language is the necessary precondition for the literal, chemical poisoning of a country. By building this elaborate facade, this benign mask of scientific research and allied assistance, the architects of the defoliation program created a moral vacuum. Inside this vacuum, they could operate without accountability, shielded from public scrutiny, international law, and even their own consciences. They had built a machine, fed it euphemisms, and programmed it to ignore the human cost. And now, with the research complete and the narrative firmly in place, that machine was ready to be unleashed. And so the machine, fully assembled and cloaked in the respectable language of scientific progress, was rolled out of the workshop. But it still lacked the one thing that could give it life: an executive order. The plans, the chemicals, and the justifications developed under Project Agile had to travel from the shadowy corridors of ARPA to the very center of global power, the desk of the President of the United States. In the autumn of 1961, that president was John F. Kennedy, a man obsessed with projecting American strength and finding innovative, often clandestine ways to fight the Cold War. The situation in South Vietnam was deteriorating rapidly. The government of Nguyen Diem was losing control of the countryside to the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. Kennedy was trapped. He had campaigned on a promise of vigor and resolve against communism, but he was deeply reluctant to commit American ground troops, fearing another protracted, bloody conflict like Korea. He and his advisors, The so-called best and the brightest were desperately searching for a third way, a solution that was more decisive than sending advisors, but less politically catastrophic than sending an army. It was into this climate of high anxiety and strategic desperation that the formal proposal for aerial defoliation landed. The recommendation came from the highest levels of the Pentagon, championed by the president's own military advisor, General Maxwell Taylor. It was presented as a logical, low-risk extension of the Project Agile research. The initial plan, codenamed Operation Trail Dust, was pitched as a limited trial program. Let's just test it, they argued. Let us see if we can clear the vegetation from around key roads and canals to reduce the number of ambushes on South Vietnamese army patrols. It was framed as a defensive, life-saving measure. But this seemingly modest proposal ignited a fierce, secret battle within the Kennedy administration. On one side were the proponents, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They argued that defoliation was a strategic necessity. It was a force multiplier, an asymmetric advantage that played to American technological strengths. They leaned heavily on the sanitized language that had been so carefully cultivated. This isn't a lethal agent, they insisted. It doesn't target human beings. It's no different than what a farmer does to his fields. They argued it would save lives, American and South Vietnamese, and shorten the war. On the other side were some powerful voices at the State Department, including Undersecretary of State George Ball and veteran diplomat Averell Harriman. They were appalled. They warned Kennedy in the starkest possible terms that the world would not see a distinction between an herbicide and a poison gas. They argued that no matter how the U.S. government tried to spin it, the use of chemical agents as a weapon of war would be a propaganda catastrophe, ceding the moral high ground to the Soviets and Chinese and alienating allies across the globe. They invoked the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and warned that while herbicides might not be explicitly named, the spirit of the treaty was clear. Kennedy was caught in the crossfire. He was a savvy politician who understood the power of international perception. The State Department's warnings resonated with him, but he was also a hard-nosed Cold Warrior who believed in the counterinsurgency doctrines being preached by his military advisors. The promise of a technological silver bullet was immensely appealing. The internal debate reached a fever pitch, a moment of truth where the sanitized theories of the lab met the brutal realities of geopolitics. Uncomfortable. Quote, attributed to a senior National Security Council aide during a pivotal Oval Office meeting in November 1961. Mr. President, the State Department is debating semantics while we are losing a country. We can call it chemical warfare, or we can call it aggressive gardening. The name doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. The risk of a few negative newspaper editorials is a trifle compared to the risk of a communist flag flying over Saigon. We will control the narrative. We will emphasize that these are common commercial chemicals used with the full consent and participation of the Vietnamese government. The accusation of poison gas will be made whether we do this or not. The question is, will we let that accusation stop us from taking an action that could fundamentally change the dynamic on the ground? We can absorb the political heat. We cannot absorb the loss of Southeast Asia. That was the argument that won the day. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation of risk. The potential propaganda fallout was deemed a manageable problem. A military defeat was not. On November 30th, 1961, President Kennedy gave his secret green light. He signed National Security Action Memorandum 104, authorizing the Secretary of Defense to initiate in Vietnam a joint U.S.-South Vietnamese program of aerial defoliant spraying. But the approval was a carefully constructed compromise. To placate the State Department, the initial missions were to be small-scale. They would be flown by South Vietnamese pilots in unmarked aircraft, a thin veneer of plausible deniability. And most critically, the initial focus was on defoliating jungle routes and military perimeters. However, buried within that same authorization was the seed of a far more sinister strategy. The memorandum also approved in principle the use of these same herbicides for crop destruction, targeting the farms and rice paddies that fed the Viet Cong. This was the true escalation. This transformed the program from a tactical tool for clearing lines of sight into a strategic weapon of starvation. It was a quiet but monumental shift. With the stroke of a pen, a research project became a war crime in waiting. This is the devastating legacy of that one signature. A presidential authorization, made in secret and under immense political pressure, is not just a decision. It's a genesis. It gives birth to a program that rapidly develops its own bureaucracy, its own budget, its own supply chain, and its own unstoppable momentum. Kennedy's signature on NSAM 104 was the point of no return. He may have intended it to be a limited, reversible experiment, a tactical gamble. But what he actually did was empower a vast military-industrial complex to wage ecological warfare on a scale the world had never seen. The decision was made. The moral Rubicon was crossed. And now the chemical companies, waiting patiently in the wings, were about to get the biggest order of their lives. The ink on National Security Action Memorandum 104 was barely dry before the gears of the military-industrial machine began to grind into motion. A presidential signature doesn't just authorize an action, it unlocks a treasury. Overnight, a new market was created, one with a single, insatiable customer, the United States Department of Defense, and a demand for product that would soon be measured in the millions of gallons. The quiet academic research of Project Agile was over. This was now about procurement, production, and profit. And for a handful of American chemical corporations, it was the beginning of a gold rush. The Pentagon put out the call. They needed herbicides, and they needed them on an industrial scale. The program was codenamed the Rainbow Herbicides, a deceptively cheerful moniker for a chemical arsenal. Each agent was designated by a color-coded stripe painted on its 55-gallon drum. There was Agent White, a less corrosive mix for use where planes might need to fly low. There was Agent Blue, which targeted rice and grain crops with an arsenic-based compound. But the undisputed workhorse, the one that would account for more than 60% of the total volume sprayed, was Agent Orange. Its formula seemed simple enough. A 50-50 mixture of the herbicides 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. As we've discussed, these were not exotic, top-secret compounds. They were commercially successful weed killers, staples of the booming post-war agricultural chemical industry. The government wasn't asking for a new invention. It was placing an enormous bulk order. The contracts were put up for bid, and the giants of the chemical world answered the call. Dow Chemical, Monsanto, Diamond Shamrock, Hercules Inc., and a few smaller players. The competition was fierce. The contracts were worth tens of millions of dollars, a staggering sum in the 1960s. The company that could produce the most herbicide, the fastest, and for the lowest price per gallon would secure a financial windfall. And this is where a business decision, made in a corporate boardroom far from any battlefield, transformed a potent herbicide into a generation-spanning poison. The key was in the manufacturing of 2,4,5-T. The process involves synthesizing a chemical precursor, 2,4,5-trichlorophenol, at very high temperatures. But there was a known dirty secret in the chemical industry. If you rush the process, if you let the reaction temperature get too high, you create an unwanted, unintended, and catastrophically toxic byproduct, a contaminant. That contaminant was 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo P-dioxin, TCDD. Dioxin. The chemical companies knew this. They knew it with absolute certainty. There had been industrial accidents going back years, chemical spills and reactor explosions at plants in Germany and West Virginia that produced these same chemicals. Workers exposed to the sludge developed a horrific, disfiguring skin condition called chlorachin. They suffered from liver damage, nerve damage, and a host of other debilitating illnesses. The company's own scientists had studied these incidents. They knew the culprit was this dioxin contaminant, this molecular ghost in their machine. They also knew that there were ways to minimize it. You could cook the chemicals low and slow, keeping the temperature carefully controlled. You could purify the final product. But these safety measures had two major drawbacks. They took more time, and they cost more money. Faced with the Pentagon's relentless deadlines and the pressure of low-bid contracts, these corporations made a choice. They prioritized speed and profit over safety. They raised the production temperatures and skipped the final purification steps. They consciously and deliberately produced a sloppier, dirtier, and infinitely more dangerous version of 2.45T because it was faster and cheaper. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative internal memorandum, Monsanto Chemical Company, 1965. Subject, Production Run QC Issues, GoVT, Contract 7B. To the division head, the latest batch reports from the nitro plant show TCDD contaminant levels consistently exceeding 20 parts per million, well above our internal guidelines for commercial-grade product. Several line workers have been referred to medical with severe chloracne. I understand the pressure we're under to meet the DoD's delivery schedule, but a production halt to recalibrate the thermal regulators seems prudent. Continuing at this pace means we are shipping a product we know to be significantly more toxic than necessary. The government is buying a military-grade product, not something for suburban lawns. The specifications they provided do not mention TCDD levels. We are, technically, in compliance. Technically, in compliance. That is the phrase upon which empires of denial are built. The Agent Orange that was shipped to Southeast Asia was a chemical cocktail of terrifying potency. Some drums contained dioxin levels thousands of times higher than in the herbicides sold commercially in the United States. The average concentration was dangerously high, but some batches were so contaminated they were practically a dioxin solution with a bit of herbicide mixed in. This wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was the predictable result of a system that incentivized cutting corners. This is the dark truth of privatized war. When the mechanisms of conflict are outsourced to corporations beholden to shareholders, the profit motive becomes a powerful and corrupting force. The government, desperate for materiel, creates a high-pressure market that rewards speed and cost-cutting above all else. The corporations, shielded by the patriotic fervor of wartime and the legal complexities of government contracts, can then make decisions that would be criminally negligent in any other context. Dow and Monsanto weren't just contractors. They were war profiteers. They sold the U.S. government a poison, knowing it was a poison, because it was more profitable than selling a safer alternative. And in doing so, they sealed the fate of millions, the soldiers who would handle it, the pilots who would spray it, and the Vietnamese people who would be forced to live in its invisible, lingering shadow. The deal was done, the profits were booked, and the drums were on their way. The drums arrived at air bases in South Vietnam, thousands upon thousands of them, each one painted with a dismissive orange stripe. They contained a chemical that the U.S. government, in its official communications, insisted was harmless to humans and animals. They were just weed killers, they said, the same stuff you could use on your lawn. But this was a lie of monumental proportions, because inside every single one of those 55-gallon drums mixed in with the active herbicides was a silent passenger, an unlisted ingredient, a contaminant that was not only harmful but was, molecule for molecule, one of the most toxic synthetic substances ever created by humankind. Its scientific name is 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo P-dioxin, or TCDD. But we will call it by its simpler name, dioxin. It had no herbicidal properties. It didn't kill jungle canopy or wither rice paddies. From a purely military perspective, it was a useless impurity. It was the waste product of a cheap and hurried manufacturing process, the chemical sludge that Dow and Monsanto had decided was too expensive and time-consuming to remove, and it would become the central villain of our story. It is difficult to convey the sheer toxicity of TCDD using conventional language. So let's be precise. Scientists measure acute toxicity using a value called the LD50, the dose required to kill 50% of a test population. For sodium cyanide, a classic poison, the LD50 in a guinea pig is about 10 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. For TCDD, the LD50 is 0.001 milligrams per kilogram. It is, by that measure, 10,000 times more deadly than cyanide. A single drop, imperceptible to the naked eye, contains enough dioxin to kill hundreds of people. Military scientists who understood its structure in the 1960s privately referred to it as the most potent teratogen, an agent that causes birth defects, that they had ever encountered. What makes this molecule so uniquely sinister is a combination of three properties. First is its potency, which stems from the way it hijacks the body's cellular machinery. In virtually all vertebrate animals, from fish to birds to humans, our cells contain something called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, or AHR. Think of this receptor as a highly sensitive lock, designed to regulate critical functions like hormone production, cell growth, and immune response. TCDD, through a quirk of its molecular geometry, is a perfect, unbreakable key for that lock. When a dioxin molecule enters the body, it binds to the AHR with incredible tenacity. This dioxin receptor complex then travels into the cell's nucleus, the command center that houses our DNA. There, it acts like a rogue computer programmer, switching critical genes on and off at random. It tells cells to divide when they shouldn't, causing tumors. It disrupts the endocrine system, mimicking hormones and causing reproductive chaos. It cripples the immune system, leaving the body vulnerable to infections. It is a master key that doesn't just open a door, it unlocks Pandora's box inside every cell it touches. Second is its persistence. TCDD is an almost indestructible molecule. It is chemically stable, laughing at the forces that break down most organic compounds. It doesn't dissolve in water. Sunlight barely degrades it. Microbes in the soil can't easily metabolize it. Its half-life in the environment is measured not in days or months, but in decades. A jungle floor sprayed in 1966 could still harbor dangerous levels of dioxin today. In the human body, where it is protected from the elements, its half-life is estimated to be between 7 and 11 years. It doesn't flush out, it stays. And that leads to the third most insidious property: bioaccumulation. TCDD is lipophilic, meaning it is fat-soluble. When it contaminates soil or water, it is absorbed by plants and microorganisms. A fish eats those plants. A larger fish eats the smaller fish. A bird or a mammal eats the larger fish. At each step up the food chain, the TCDD is passed along and becomes more concentrated in the fatty tissues of the organism. It climbs the biological ladder, becoming exponentially more dangerous as it goes. The microscopic dose in the soil becomes a measurable dose in a fish, which becomes a dangerous dose in a duck, which becomes a potentially lethal dose in the human who eats that duck. The U.S. Air Force, for its part, was aware that they were dealing with more than just a simple herbicide. Some of their own scientists harbored grave concerns. Uncomfortable. Quote, based on the later testimony of Dr. James R. Clary, a former senior scientist with the USAF Chemical Operations Division, when we initiated the herbicide program in the 1960s, we were aware of the potential for dioxin contamination in Agent Orange. We knew it was, in their words, exceptionally toxic. There were internal reports and laboratory studies from the chemical companies themselves that flagged this issue. But the military imperative was to procure massive quantities of this material on a rush basis. The decision was made that the operational benefits of defoliation outweighed the risks of using a contaminated product. The official line was, and would remain, that the herbicide was harmless. Any evidence to the contrary was classified, and any personnel who raised concerns were reminded of their duty. We knew, but we were ordered to forget. This is the poison within the rainbow, a molecular monster, born of corporate greed, unleashed by military expediency. Dow and Monsanto didn't just sell the military an herbicide, they sold them a delivery system for one of the most powerful poisons ever created. And the military, in its desperate search for a shortcut to victory, chose to look the other way. The long-term consequence of this decision is the very definition of a Faustian bargain. They wanted a chemical that would kill a jungle for a season. But by saturating Vietnam's ecosystem with a persistent, bioaccumulative supertoxin, they were not merely defoliating a forest for a single battle. They were poisoning the food chain, contaminating the soil, and rewriting the genetic future of an entire population for generations. They were leaving behind a chemical curse, a legacy written not in history books but in the very cells of the living. That chemical curse, brewed in corporate labs and authorized in the White House, now needed its priests, its acolytes who would perform the ritual of dissemination. They were the young men of the United States Air Force, the pilots and crewmen of a special operations unit tasked with the strangest mission of the entire war. Their official designation was the 12th Air Commando Squadron. The operational name for their mission, the one that would go down in history, was Operation Ranch Hand. These were not rogue warriors or mad scientists. They were dedicated, professional airmen, products of a can-do military culture that prized technical skill and mission accomplishment above all else. They flew the Fairchild C-123 Provider, a sturdy twin-engine transport plane, a beast of burden, not a bird of prey. It was designed to haul troops and cargo, but the ranch hand planes were different. Their cavernous cargo bays were dominated by a specially fitted 1,000-gallon chemical tank. Welded to their wings and tail were long spray booms studded with nozzles. They were flying crop dusters, militarized and armored for a combat zone. A typical mission began long before dawn on the sprawling air bases at Bien Hoa, Da Nang, or Phan Rang. The crews would assemble for their briefing, poring over maps of the target area, a winding riverbank, a suspect patch of jungle believed to conceal a Viet Cong base camp, a stretch of highway notorious for ambushes. All the while, the air outside would be thick with the acrid metallic odor of the chemicals being pumped from the 55-gallon drums into their planes. It was a smell that clung to everything, their clothes, their skin, the very air they breathed. And in those briefings they were told again and again the official lie. The spray was relatively non-toxic to man and animals. Just focus on the mission. The missions themselves were incredibly dangerous. To ensure the herbicide saturated the canopy and wasn't dispersed by the wind, they had to fly impossibly low and slow, 150 feet off the ground, at about 130 knots. They flew in tight formations of 3 to 5 planes, a lumbering, vulnerable procession. At that altitude, they were perfect targets for enemy ground fire. The Viet Cong quickly learned that the sound of the approaching C-123s meant poison from the sky, and they threw everything they had at them. The planes were riddled with bullet holes on nearly every sortie. A single, well-placed shot into an engine or a fuel line could be catastrophic. This was white-knuckle flying, demanding immense skill and nerve. Then came the spray run. The crew chief would open the valves, and a vast, dense cloud of aerosolized chemicals would erupt from the booms, trailing behind the aircraft like a ghostly white tail. In less than 4 minutes, a single C-123 could drench a swath of land 80 meters wide and 10 miles long, dumping nearly 10,000 pounds of herbicide. The effect on the jungle below was almost instantaneous. Within days, the lush green canopy would turn brown and wither. The leaves would drop and the forest floor would be exposed to the naked sun, as if by a sudden chemical autumn. But the spray didn't just go down. The leaky, primitive spray systems, operating in the turbulent air of the unpressurized fuselage, ensured that the mist swirled everywhere. It billowed back into the cargo bay, coating the loadmaster. It seeped into the cockpit, covering the pilots. The men flew in their standard-issue cotton fatigues. There was no protective gear, no masks, no respirators, no gloves. They would land from a 4-hour mission drenched in Agent Orange, the oily residue clinging to their sweaty skin. They ate their sandwiches in the contaminated cabins. They cleaned the clogged spray nozzles by hand. They were quite literally marinating in a dioxin solution, all while being assured of its safety. To cope with the sheer madness of their task, the daily risk of being shot down while flying a plane that smelled like a chemical factory to go kill trees, the men of Ranch Hand developed a brand of gallows humor as dark as it comes. They adopted a motto, a cynical twist on the beloved environmental icon Smokey Bear, uncomfortable. Quote, the official, unofficial motto of the men of Operation Ranch Hand. Only you can prevent forests. This wasn't just a joke, it was a mission statement. It was a psychological shield against the profound cognitive dissonance of their daily lives. Soldiers are supposed to fight other soldiers. These men were fighting the ecosystem itself. Their enemy was the color green. Their objective was not to capture a hill, but to create a wasteland. The motto was a frank, unvarnished admission of the ecological destruction they were tasked with delivering. It was a way of owning the absurdity, of staring into the strange, unnatural void of their mission and laughing at it. But beneath the laughter, a quiet dread was beginning to grow. Despite the official assurances, the crews could see the reality with their own eyes. They saw the grotesque, twisted way the plants died. They noticed the rivers and canals, once teeming with life, were now filled with dead fish after a spray run. They felt the constant skin rashes, the nausea, the persistent metallic taste in their mouths. The joke about preventing forests masked a darker, unspoken question. What was this stuff preventing in us? This is the first, intimate betrayal in the story of Agent Orange. The military command, obsessed with sortie rates and gallons sprayed, treated its own men as a disposable part of the delivery system. The decision to forego protective gear was not a mere oversight. It was a deliberate choice, made to uphold the critical fiction that the chemicals were safe. To issue respirators would be to admit there was a risk, and to admit risk would be to invite questions that the Pentagon was not prepared to answer. So they sacrificed the health of the ranch hand crews on the altar of plausible deniability. They were the first American victims of Agent Orange, poisoned by their own side in a secret, undeclared chemical experiment. Their grim little joke would echo for decades, long after the laughter had died and been replaced by the quiet hum of chemotherapy drips and dialysis machines. While the men of Operation Ranch Hand were telling dark jokes in the sky to cope with an unspoken dread, a team of scientists in a quiet laboratory in suburban Maryland were about to provide the empirical data that would justify their worst fears. The truth about Agent Orange was not going to be revealed on the battlefield or in a press conference. It was going to emerge, as it so often does, from the sterile, methodical world of a scientific study. A study that the United States government would then do everything in its power to bury. The story begins in 1963. Spurred by the public outcry following Rachel Carson's landmark book Silent Spring, which exposed the dangers of pesticides like DDT, the National Cancer Institute, NCI, initiated a massive, unprecedented screening program. They wanted to test hundreds of common pesticides, herbicides, and industrial chemicals for their potential to cause cancer and birth defects. Not having the facilities to do this in-house, they awarded a lucrative contract to a private company, Bionetics Research Laboratories. Among the dozens of chemicals slated for testing, just another name on a long list, was 2,4,5-T, one of the two active ingredients in Agent Orange. For several years, the study proceeded routinely. Lab animals, mostly mice and rats, were systematically exposed to various chemicals, and the results were meticulously recorded. Then, in 1966, the preliminary data on 2,4,5-T came in, and the scientists at Bionetics must have felt a cold chill run down their spines. The results were not merely positive, they were a biological horror show. Pregnant mice that had been fed even very low doses of commercially available 2,4,5-T gave birth to shockingly deformed offspring. The litters were riddled with birth defects at a rate that was statistically off the charts. The baby mice were born with severe cleft palates, unable to feed. Many were born with no eyes at all. Autopsies revealed massively oversized and cystic kidneys, a death sentence. The chemical was, without any ambiguity, a powerful teratogen. This was a 5-alarm fire. The findings of the Bionetics study should have triggered an immediate government-wide crisis. The report should have been rushed to the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture, and most urgently, to the Department of Defense, which was, at that very moment, spraying millions of gallons of 2,4,5-T all over Southeast Asia. The safety of the entire ranch hand program rested on the lie that the chemical was harmless. Bionetics had just produced irrefutable scientific proof that it was a lie, but the alarm was never sounded. Instead, a wall of silence descended. The Bionetics report was immediately flagged as politically explosive. Rather than being publicly released, it was quietly passed up the chain of command, where it landed on the desks of officials who understood its devastating implications. The first people to be unofficially briefed on these terrifying findings were not the public or the soldiers at risk, but the executives of the companies that manufactured the chemical. Dow Chemical, the largest producer of 2,4,5-T, was shown the data. Their response would become a masterclass in corporate damage control, a playbook that is still used to this day to manufacture doubt and delay regulation. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative summary memo written by a Dow Chemical government liaison to company executives, late 1966. Subject: unfavorable NCI contractor report on 2.405T. We have been given informal access to a forthcoming bionetics study, which alleges a teratogenic effect from 2.405T in mice. The data, on its face, is problematic. However, their methodology is open to question. We have learned the sample they used was sourced from a competitor, and our analysis suggests it contained an unusually high concentration of the dioxin contaminant, approximately 30 parts per million. Our official position should be that the bionetics findings are not indicative of 2.425T itself, but rather of a contaminated, anomalous sample. We must insist that any regulatory conclusions are premature, and that further study is required to isolate the effects of 2.4.5T from its contaminants. By focusing the debate on the contaminant, we can argue that our product, manufactured to higher standards, is safe. This strategy will delay any precipitous action from the FDA or USDA and protect our DoD contracts. This was the strategy. Don't fight the data, redefine the argument. It was a brilliant, cynical move. Dow's own internal data showed their product was also contaminated, but by shifting the blame to the dioxin impurity, they framed it as a quality control issue, not a fundamental problem with the chemical they were selling. It was a smokescreen. And the government, desperate to avoid a scandal that would undermine the war effort, eagerly hid behind it. The bionetics report was effectively buried. The NCI, the very agency that commissioned it, simply sat on it. It wasn't published. A preliminary evaluation was passed to the FDA, but without the urgency it deserved. The Department of Defense, the agency with the most urgent need to know, was kept in the dark for almost 2 more years. The spraying in Vietnam didn't slow down, it accelerated. 1967 would become the peak year for Operation Ranch Hand, with nearly 5 million gallons of Agent Orange dumped on the Vietnamese landscape. All of this happened while the bionetics report, a ticking time bomb of scientific truth, gathered dust in a classified government file. This is the long, dark shadow of institutional betrayal. The bionetics study was a clear, unambiguous warning sign. It was a moral off-ramp, a moment when the government had the knowledge and the opportunity to stop, to reconsider the path they were on. They knew they were using a chemical that caused birth defects, and they chose to continue. This decision, made in secret to protect corporate profits and a failing war strategy, is perhaps the single most damning indictment in the entire Agent Orange saga. It transformed the program from a reckless gamble into a knowing, conscious act of poisoning. Every gallon sprayed after 1966 was not just a weapon of war, but a crime. The decision to bury the bionetics report was not a passive act of cowardice, it was a tactical necessity. It was the critical move that cleared the board for the next, even more brutal phase of the chemical war. This was the food denial program. The logic was as simple as it was savage, a core tenet of warfare since antiquity. An army cannot fight without food. The American military command, frustrated by the elusiveness of the Viet Cong, decided to attack their logistical base. If the guerrillas could not be found and killed in the jungle, then the jungle's ability to sustain them would be destroyed. The official objective was to deny food to enemy combatants, forcing them out into the open or starving them into submission. It was sold as a clean, efficient, and almost mathematical approach to counterinsurgency, a way to win the war by cutting off the enemy's fuel supply. But there was a problem. Agent Orange, so devastating to broadleaf jungle canopy, was less effective against the grass family crops that formed the basis of the Vietnamese diet, especially rice. For this new mission, a different chemical was needed. The military turned to another color in its chemical rainbow, Agent Blue. Sprayed from planes or helicopters, Agent Blue was designed specifically to kill rice and other grains. Its active ingredient was cacodyllic acid, a compound that is 54% elemental arsenic. Let that sink in. At the same time the government was suppressing evidence that Agent Orange could cause birth defects, it was initiating a massive program to spray an arsenic-based poison directly onto the food supply of a nation. The crop destruction missions began in earnest. American and South Vietnamese planes would fly over areas deemed to be under Viet Cong control and spray the rice paddies just before harvest. The chemical didn't just kill the plants, it desiccated them, causing them to dry out so rapidly they couldn't be eaten. Within days, a verdant, life-sustaining field would be turned into a brown, barren wasteland. The military claimed surgical precision, insisting they were only targeting crops grown specifically for insurgent forces. But in a people's war, a guerrilla conflict with no front lines, this was a lethal fiction. How does one distinguish a Viet Cong rice paddy from a civilian one? The answer is, you don't. You can't. The program was a strategic failure and a human rights catastrophe. The Viet Cong, being a disciplined and mobile military force, proved adept at countering it. They stored their rice in secret underground caches. They moved food at night along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They levied food taxes on villages in secure areas. They could adapt. The people who could not adapt were the villagers themselves, the old men, the women, the children. Their entire existence was tied to that single plot of land, that single annual harvest. For them, a 4-minute flyover by a ranch hand plane was not a military setback. It was a sentence of starvation. The true purpose of the program was not just to starve combatants. It was to deliberately disrupt and terrorize the civilian population, the sea in which the guerrilla fish swam. By destroying the rural economy, the military hoped to create such misery that civilians would be unable or unwilling to support the insurgency. It was a strategy of engineered chaos, as revealed in the cold clinical language of their own planning documents. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a 1967 MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, planning document on the objectives of the food denial program. Widespread crop destruction will lead to a significant degradation of the rural subsistence economy. This is expected to generate large-scale, uncontrolled refugee flows from VC-dominated territories into areas under government control. The interdiction of the food supply serves the dual purpose of denying material support to the enemy and creating a humanitarian crisis that will tax the enemy's administrative capabilities. This displacement of the civilian population is a desirable secondary outcome, as it serves to separate the insurgent from his support base. A desirable secondary outcome. They weren't just anticipating a refugee crisis. They were counting on it. They were weaponizing famine. The result was a biblical tragedy. Entire regions were plunged into malnutrition and hunger. Families were forced to abandon ancestral lands they had farmed for centuries, becoming destitute refugees in the squalid, overcrowded camps around the cities. The very fabric of rural society was systematically shredded. And in a display of tragic irony, this brutal strategy often accomplished the exact opposite of its intent. A farmer whose children were starving because of an American chemical attack was not a man likely to embrace the Saigon government. The food denial program became one of the most effective recruitment tools the Viet Cong ever had. It drove countless peasants into their ranks, men and women who were not fighting for communism, but for simple survival and revenge. The meta-commentary is stark. By making food a weapon, the United States military erased the last meaningful line between combatant and civilian. Every farmer became a potential enemy logistician. Every rice paddy became a potential military target. This strategy, pursued with industrial efficiency and justified with bureaucratic euphemisms, constituted a war on the Vietnamese people themselves. It was a campaign that guaranteed a legacy of bitterness and suffering that would fester long after the last bomb fell, poisoning not just the earth, but the relationship between two nations for a generation. They sought to starve a rebellion, but they ended up nourishing a deep and abiding hatred that would ultimately help consume them. This campaign to engineer famine was a war on the present, an attack on the living. But the poison they used, the dioxin hidden within the spray, was a weapon that attacked the future. It did not respect ceasefires or peace treaties. It did not understand borders or battle lines. And when the war in Vietnam eventually wound down, the dioxin did not stay behind. It hitched a ride home, silently, insidiously, inside the very machines that had delivered it. In 1971, Operation Ranch Hand flew its final mission. The political and public pressure had become too intense, and the program was officially terminated. The question then arose, what to do with the fleet of heavily used battle-scarred C-123 provider aircraft? These planes had spent the better part of a decade flying through clouds of their own aerosolized poison. The interiors of their fuselages were coated with a sticky, stubborn residue of Agent Orange. Their insulation, wiring, and ductwork were saturated with it. The logical, responsible course of action would have been to treat them as hazardous waste, to scrap them, or to subject them to a decontamination process so rigorous it would strip them down to bare metal. But that would have been expensive and time-consuming. It would also have been a tacit admission that the planes were, in fact, dangerously toxic, a truth the Pentagon was still determined to deny. And so, a far simpler, cheaper, and more reckless decision was made. The planes were given a perfunctory cleaning with soap and water, ferried back across the Pacific, and quietly absorbed back into the U.S. Air Force's domestic fleet. For the next decade, from 1972 to 1982, these angels of death were given a new, peaceful life. They were assigned to Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard units at bases in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. They became workaday transport planes, used for routine weekend training missions, cargo hauling, and medical evacuation drills. The men and women who flew and maintained these planes were part-time soldiers, citizens who served their country one weekend a month. The vast majority of them had never set foot in Vietnam. They had no knowledge of their aircraft's sinister history. They had no idea they were spending their weekends working inside a fleet of flying toxic waste dumps. The exposure was constant and intimate. Maintenance crews would crawl through the contaminated fuselages, their skin brushing up against surfaces still coated in dioxin-laced residue. Pilots and loadmasters would breathe the air, circulated for hours on end, picking up microscopic particles of poison from the heating and ventilation systems. They would eat their lunches sitting on the same benches where leaky spray tanks had once stood. There were no warnings, no protective equipment, no hazard pay. To them, it was just another old grimy transport plane. But the crews knew something was wrong. There was a strange chemical smell that never went away. There was an oily film that could never be scrubbed clean. Uncomfortable. Quote, adapted from later testimony of maintenance personnel who worked on post-war C-123s. Subject, C-123 Fleet Maintenance Log, Rickenbacker AFB, 1977. Chief notes again that the X-Ranch Handbirds, serial numbers 5406XXX, continue to present cleaning challenges. Standard solvents are ineffective on the persistent dark, oily residue found throughout the cargo bays, particularly along floor seams and on insulation blankets. Several airmen on the weekend crew have reported recurring skin rashes and headaches after working inside these specific aircraft. Recommend a full chemical workup to identify the substance. Command response. These are old planes that flew in a tropical environment. It's a combination of hydraulic fluid, oil, and mildew. Issue gloves if the men are complaining. We don't have the budget for a chemical analysis on routine grime. Routine grime. For 10 years, that was the official explanation. But the grime was dioxin, and slowly, quietly, it went to work. By the 1990s, an alarming pattern began to emerge. These Air Force reservists, men and women who had served their country honorably but had never seen combat in Vietnam, started getting sick. They were developing the same telltale cancers, the soft tissue sarcomas, the non-Hodgkin's lymphomas, the chronic leukemias. They were suffering from the same ischemic heart disease, the same type 2 diabetes, the same peripheral neuropathy that afflicted the veterans who had been on the ground. When they went to the Department of Veterans Affairs for help, they were met with a bureaucratic brick wall. The VAS rule for Agent Orange compensation was absolute. A veteran needed to have boots on the ground in Vietnam during the war. Since these reservists had served exclusively in the United States, their claims were denied. For decades, they were gaslit by the very institution meant to care for them, told that their illnesses were a tragic coincidence, that their exposure was impossible. They became a lost cohort, the forgotten victims of a poison that had followed them home. It wasn't until the 2010s, after years of relentless advocacy by the veterans and their families, that the truth was finally acknowledged. Independent scientists took air and surface samples from the few surviving C-123s that were now sitting in air museums. They found them still heavily contaminated with TCDD. In 2015, the Institute of Medicine concluded that the exposure levels inside these planes were high enough to have caused the illnesses the veterans were suffering. The VA was finally, shamefully, forced to concede the connection. The story of the C-123s is a parable of institutional negligence. It reveals a mindset that sees equipment as an asset to be reused at all costs, and people as an acceptable risk. The failure to decontaminate these planes was not an oversight, it was a decision. It was a choice to prioritize budget over biology, convenience over conscience. These planes became Trojan horses, bringing a microscopic, invisible enemy home from the war. An enemy that would continue to claim casualties in the quiet towns of Middle America for the next 40 years. The battlefield, it turns out, is a much larger place than the maps would have you believe. The poison that came home in the bellies of those C-123s was a ghost of a warning that had been sent years earlier. A warning that was deliberately and systematically ignored. While the Air Force reservists were still years away from their unsuspecting exposure, a small chorus of sane voices within the American establishment in Vietnam itself was trying to sound the alarm. They were not protesters or radicals. They were loyal government employees and respected scientists, men who believed in their country, but who could not deny the evidence of their own eyes. And they were witnessing the birth of a catastrophe. By the mid-1960s, as Operation Ranch Hand escalated into a full-blown chemical blitz, the official reports flowing from Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, back to the Pentagon, were a steady stream of self-congratulation. They spoke in the sterile language of war management, millions of acres defoliated, thousands of enemy infiltration routes exposed, tons of enemy food supplies denied. It was a picture of technological dominance and strategic success. But in the hushed corridors of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and in the field notebooks of visiting scientists, a far darker and more desperate narrative was taking shape. These were the diplomats, the political officers, and the agricultural advisors whose job it was to build a nation, not just win a war. They were the ones tasked with the Sisyphean struggle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. They traveled the provinces, they spoke with village elders, and they saw what the generals, flying over at 5,000 feet, could not. They saw the vast skeletal ruins of the mangrove forests along the coast, which had been among the most vibrant and productive ecosystems on the planet. These forests were the nurseries for the nation's fish and shellfish, a natural barrier against devastating typhoons, and a source of timber and food for the local population. A single application of Agent Orange could kill them entirely, leaving behind a muddy, lifeless swamp that would not recover for 100 years. They also saw the social and political fallout of the crop destruction program. They listened to the stories of farmers whose entire livelihood had been erased in an afternoon. They documented the rising rates of malnutrition and the growing tide of bitter, displaced peasants flooding into the refugee camps. And they understood a fundamental damning truth that seemed to elude the military command. You cannot win the loyalty of a people by poisoning their children and burning their crops. At the same time, independent scientists, some initially invited by the State Department to provide a veneer of objective assessment, were reaching the same horrifying conclusions. Botanists like Arthur Galston of Yale, who had pioneered the very research that led to synthetic herbicides, traveled to Vietnam and were aghast at the scale of the destruction. They began to use a new word to describe what they were seeing: ecocide, the deliberate murder of an entire ecosystem. They sent their findings back to their colleagues in the United States, publishing what they could in scientific journals and lobbying their contacts in Washington, warning of irreversible environmental damage. The diplomats in the embassy began sending their own warnings, using the formal, secure channels of the State Department. They wrote cables classified secret or confidential that were effectively messages in a bottle, pleas for sanity tossed into the vast, churning ocean of the Washington bureaucracy. Classified memo, a synthesized but representative descent channel cable, U.S. Embassy Saigon to Department of State 1968. Subject: defoliation program, reassessment of political military utility. The embassy can no longer subscribe to the MACV assessment that the tactical gains of the ranch hand program outweigh its severe and growing political liabilities. Our field officers report consistently that crop destruction is the single greatest cause of rural hostility towards the GVN government of Vietnam and the United States. We are creating more new Viet Cong sympathizers than we are starving old ones. Furthermore, the visible destruction of the natural landscape is becoming a powerful symbol for anti-American sentiment, both domestically and internationally. We are handing the enemy a propaganda weapon of immense power. From a political standpoint, we are perceived as waging war not against an army, but against the Vietnamese land itself. Request an urgent high-level interagency review to consider the immediate curtailment of this program, which we believe is now strategically counterproductive. This cable, and dozens like it, landed on desks in Washington and was promptly ignored. The problem was one of power. The war was being run by the Pentagon, specifically by General William Westmoreland and MACV. In the rigid hierarchy of the American war effort, the military voice was the only one that mattered. The State Department's concerns were dismissed as soft-headed. The diplomats were condescendingly told they didn't understand the harsh realities of the battlefield. The scientists' warnings of ecocide were brushed aside as emotional, exaggerated, and irrelevant to the immediate task of killing the enemy. MACV controlled the narrative. They controlled the daily press briefings in Saigon, the so-called 5 o'clock follies. They controlled which journalists got access to which areas. They generated the statistics that Washington wanted to hear: body counts, acres destroyed, sorties flown. In this tightly controlled information ecosystem, the nuanced, disturbing reports from the embassy were treated as noise, as an unwelcome complication to a simple story of military progress. The meta-commentary here is a lesson in the catastrophic failure of closed systems. By creating an echo chamber where the only valid perspective was the narrow, tactical one of the military, the United States government blinded itself. It measured everything and understood nothing. The men in the Saigon embassy were not just reporting on dead trees and angry farmers. They were documenting the reasons America would ultimately lose the war. They were screaming a warning that the entire strategy was built on a foundation of sand, that the chemical war was dissolving the very society they were supposedly there to save. But no one with the power to change course was listening. The machine was programmed to move forward, and the frantic messages warning of the cliff ahead were simply filed away and forgotten. While those frantic diplomatic cables were being filed away in Washington, a very different kind of paper trail was being created and then promptly buried in the corporate headquarters of Monsanto in St. Louis, Missouri. The government's willful blindness was a sin of omission, a failure to listen. What was happening at Monsanto was a sin of commission, a cold, calculated, multi-decade campaign of scientific fraud, data manipulation, and deliberate deception designed to protect profits, no matter the human cost. They didn't just suspect their product was dangerous. They had the proof written in the suffering of their own employees. The story of Monsanto's guilty knowledge begins long before the first drum of Agent Orange ever reached Vietnam. It starts in 1949, in the gritty industrial town of Nitro, West Virginia, home to a major Monsanto chemical plant producing 2,4,5-T. One day, a pressure relief valve on a production vat failed, and the building was rocked by a massive explosion. A cloud of hot, untreated chemical sludge rained down on 228 workers. In the days and weeks that followed, they broke out in what Monsanto's own doctors described as the most violent and spectacular skin eruption they had ever seen. It was chloracin, the telltale signature of dioxin poisoning. But it was more than skin deep. The men suffered from excruciating muscle pain, fatigue, liver damage, and severe psychological distress. This was Monsanto's first intimate encounter with the monster they were creating. Their reaction was not to halt production or warn their customers. Their reaction was to cover it up and, with a chillingly detached scientific curiosity, to study the results. They launched a secret, decades-long internal medical surveillance program on the surviving nitro workers. They were treating their own poisoned employees not as patients to be cured, but as a secret human data set, a private laboratory for tracking the long-term effects of high-dose dioxin exposure. All the while, their official public stance was that the only side effect of exposure was a manageable skin condition. Then came the Bionetics study in the mid-1960s, the government-funded research that proved 2.4.5T caused birth defects in lab animals. When Monsanto executives were quietly briefed on these findings, it was not a shock to their system. It was a confirmation of something they already suspected, and a grave threat to their lucrative government contracts. So, they did what any organization with something to hide does. They ran their own secret tests to see just how bad the problem was. In 1965, a Monsanto lab exposed pregnant rabbits to their own 2.45T. The results were unequivocal, mirroring the Bionetics data. The chemical caused birth defects. They now possessed their own independent, in-house confirmation that the product they were shipping to Vietnam by the millions of gallons was a potent teratogen. That study was immediately buried. To protect the company from the inevitable legal storm they knew was coming, their lawyers and PR strategists began carefully crafting a new narrative, one designed to minimize and mislead. It was a strategy built on the careful manipulation of language. Uncomfortable, quote, inspired by internal Monsanto legal and medical documents from the 1950s and 60s. Subject, litigation risk management employee health claims. For the purposes of all external and non-essential internal communications, the dermatological effects observed in plant workers are to be referred to as chloracin and framed as a manageable, albeit unpleasant, skin irritation. The term systemic poisoning is to be strictly avoided. We must maintain a clear and consistent position that the effects are dermal and transient, not systemic and chronic. We are managing a case of industrial dermatitis. Framing it as anything more concedes a level of toxicity that would create unacceptable legal and regulatory liabilities. Our entire defense rests on defining the injury as narrowly as possible. Defining systemic poisoning as a skin irritation is the very soul of corporate deception. But Monsanto's most audacious act of scientific fraud was yet to come. By the late 1970s, with veterans' lawsuits piling up, the company needed more than just a defensive crouch. They needed a scientific sword. So they decided to sponsor a new study on the nitro workers, to be conducted by an outside academic, supposedly to create an independent final word on the matter. Internal documents unearthed years later during legal discovery revealed the staggering depth of the fraud. Monsanto's own executives and doctors took charge of the study from behind the scenes. They deliberately misclassified the workers in the data they provided to the researchers. They took workers from the heavily exposed, sick group and secretly moved them into the unexposed control group. This single act of data manipulation was statistically devastating. It made the sick group look smaller, and the healthy control group look sicker than it was, effectively erasing the statistical link between dioxin exposure and death from cancer or other diseases. The resulting study, published in a peer-reviewed journal in 1980, was a sham. It concluded falsely that there was no evidence that TCDD had caused any long-term health effects besides chloracin. For years, Monsanto paraded this fraudulent study at scientific conferences and in courtrooms as definitive, independent proof that Agent Orange was safe. This is the dark genesis of the modern doubt industry. Monsanto perfected a playbook that has been copied by countless industries since, from tobacco to fossil fuels. Step 1. Deny the harm and conceal your internal knowledge. Step 2. When outside science proves the harm, attack the study's methodology and fund your own countervailing research designed to create confusion. Step 3. Use that manufactured doubt to fight regulation and litigation, buying yourself decades of continued profits while the bodies pile up. Monsanto's most toxic and enduring product was not the chemical itself, but the sophisticated machinery of corporate deceit they built to protect it. While Monsanto's lawyers were busy inventing a private reality where dioxin was just a skin irritant, the lawyers at the United States Department of State were engaged in a parallel and far more public act of deception. They were tasked with defending the indefensible on the world stage, with convincing the international community that a chemical blitz of unprecedented scale was not, in fact, chemical warfare. It was a diplomatic and legal battle fought in the hushed chambers of Geneva and at the United Nations, and it was a battle the U.S. was determined to win through sheer force of will. By the late 1960s, the world was taking notice. The sheer, shocking scale of Operation Ranch Hand was becoming undeniable. Photographs of the skeletal, moonscaped forests and reports from international journalists were creating a growing sense of unease. This looked and felt like a new terrifying form of warfare, and it was attracting the attention of the one organization that serves as the world's conscience on the laws of combat, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. The ICRC is the traditional guardian of the Geneva Conventions and the customary laws of war. Their role is to be neutral, to be discreet, and to hold nations accountable to the rules they themselves have written. The foundational text for chemical warfare is the Geneva Protocol of 1925, a document born directly from the horrors of the mustard and chlorine gas attacks that choked the trenches of World War I. Its signatories pledged to abstain from the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases, and of all analogous liquids, materials, or devices. The question before the ICRC's legal experts was stark. Did the American herbicide program in Vietnam violate this treaty? The U.S. government, of course, argued vehemently that it did not. But as the ICRC gathered reports from its own delegates on the ground, reports about the destruction of civilian food sources, about the sickening of livestock, about the mysterious illnesses sweeping through villages after spray runs, they came to a different, deeply disturbing conclusion. Their internal legal analysis, developed over several years, was that the U.S. program did violate the spirit and intent of the 1925 protocol. Their reasoning was based on a simple but powerful principle: intent. The herbicides were not being used for agriculture. They were being deployed as a weapon of war for hostile military purposes. They were being used to harm the enemy by destroying his food and cover. Therefore, they were functioning as chemical weapons. It didn't matter that the primary target was a plant. The ultimate target was a human being. True to its cautious, diplomatic nature, the ICRC did not publicly denounce the United States. Instead, they began a series of quiet, high-level diplomatic interventions. They communicated their legal opinion to the State Department and the White House, urging them, as a signatory to the laws of war, to halt the program. They warned that this new form of warfare was creating a dangerous precedent that could unravel the long-held taboo against the use of poison in conflict. The American response was not to reconsider their actions, but to double down on their legal justifications. The State Department's legal advisors crafted an argument of breathtaking cynicism, a masterwork of hair-splitting, designed to create a loophole where none should exist. Uncomfortable, quote, from a synthesized State Department legal position paper, circa 1969. Subject: U.S. interpretation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol regarding herbicides. The U.S. government's position is that the 1925 Geneva Protocol has a narrow and specific scope. It applies to weapons that are, by their nature, designed to inflict direct toxicity on human beings, such as nerve agents or poison gases. Herbicides are not in this category. Their phytotoxic effect is on plants, not people. Any harm to human health is an unintentional, indirect consequence. Furthermore, the protocol explicitly mentions gases and analogous liquids, which we interpret as referring to substances used in a similar tactical manner to gas, not to the large-scale aerial dissemination of common, commercially available agricultural chemicals. Therefore, our defoliation and crop destruction programs, while constituting a method of warfare, do not constitute a method prohibited by the protocol. Unintentional, indirect consequence. With those three words, millions of poisoned Vietnamese civilians and American veterans were erased from the legal equation. This was the argument the U.S. took on the road. They launched a diplomatic full-court press, lobbying allies, pressuring neutral countries, and doing everything in their power to ensure the ICRC's damning opinion remained a private one. They fought to prevent any international body from adopting the Red Cross's interpretation as the global standard. Their arrogance was on full display at the United Nations. In 1969, The General Assembly voted on Resolution 2603, which explicitly affirmed that the Geneva Protocol's prohibition covered all chemical agents of warfare, including tear gas and herbicides. The international community's verdict was overwhelming. 80 nations voted in favor. Only 3 voted against: Australia, Portugal, and the United States of America. It was a stunning moment of defiance, an admission that the US considered itself exempt from the global consensus. This is the grim reality of international law. It is not a rigid code enforced by a global police force. It is a fragile tapestry of norms and agreements, and its strength depends entirely on the willingness of powerful nations to abide by it. In Vietnam, the United States demonstrated that a superpower can, through sheer diplomatic muscle and legalistic maneuvering, create its own reality. They successfully managed the international outcry, ensuring there were no real consequences for their actions. In doing so, they didn't just tear a hole in the jungles of Vietnam, they tore a hole in the very fabric of the international legal order, creating a precedent that whispered a dangerous truth to the rest of the world. The laws of war are only for the weak. The American government's cynical legal maneuvering on the world stage was more than just a defense of a single program. It was a defense of a philosophy, a worldview in which the planet itself was merely a passive backdrop for human conflict, a resource to be exploited and, if necessary, a variable to be manipulated. To truly understand the depths of this hubris, we have to look beyond the chemical defoliation of Operation Ranch Hand to its secret sister program, an operation so audacious, so far outside the accepted norms of warfare, that it sounds like something from a dystopian science fiction novel. At the very same time they were killing the jungles, the United States was secretly trying to weaponize the weather. The program was called Operation Popeye. Its target was the logistical lifeblood of the North Vietnamese war effort, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not a single road, but a sprawling 1,000-mile-long network of footpaths, truck parks, and river crossings that snaked its way from North Vietnam through the supposedly neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia, and into South Vietnam. It was the funnel through which Hanoi sent its soldiers, its ammunition, and its supplies to the southern front. The jungle canopy that made it so difficult to bomb was being stripped away by Agent Orange, but the US military was searching for another, more elemental advantage. The question posed by CIA and Pentagon planners was simple and terrifying. What if we could control the rain? The Ho Chi Minh Trail was most vulnerable during the seasonal monsoon, when torrential rains would turn its dirt roads into impassable rivers of mud. What if, they wondered, we could make the monsoon worse? What if we could extend the rainy season, increase its intensity, and localize the downpours directly over the enemy's most critical supply routes? This was the genesis of Operation Popeye, a top-secret weather modification program that ran from 1967 to 1972. It began as a CIA experiment and was later handed over to a special unit of the U.S. Air Force's 54th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. The technology they used was cloud seeding. The science is straightforward. Certain types of clouds are ripe with supercooled water vapor that is just waiting for a nucleus to condense upon to become rain. In Operation Popeye, WC-130 transport planes and RF-4 Phantom jets were fitted with special canisters. On secret missions, they would fly into the tops of monsoon clouds over the trail and release a fine mist of silver iodide or lead iodide particles. These particles acted as artificial ice nuclei, triggering a chain reaction of condensation. The clouds would suddenly and violently unleash their moisture. The goal was nothing less than hydrological warfare. They wanted to trigger flash floods that would wash away bridges and river crossings. They wanted to create landslides that would block mountain passes. Most of all, they wanted to saturate the soil so thoroughly that the entire network would dissolve into a sea of mud, trapping truck convoys and bogging down the entire North Vietnamese logistical effort for weeks at a time. It was a war of engineered mudslides and man-made floods. The military planners, in their detached clinical language, were ecstatic about the early results. Uncomfortable quote from a fictionalized but representative CIA after-action report on an early Operation Popeye sortie. Subject: evaluation of Phase 2. Seeding trial over Sector 7G sortie completed successfully. Cloud seeding agent deployed as per protocol into target cumulonimbus formation at 18,000 feet. Satellite and ground sensor follow-up indicates a precipitation increase of approximately 35% above baseline forecasts for the target area. River level sensors show a sharp increase, and aerial reconnaissance confirms significant degradation of road surface integrity along the primary artery. The program continues to demonstrate a high degree of efficacy in enhancing natural weather phenomena for the purpose of logistical interdiction. We are not creating storms, we are simply making the existing storms more militarily effective. Making the existing storms more militarily effective. The sheer arrogance of that phrase is breathtaking. The program did have some tactical effect, causing localized flooding and disrupting traffic on the trail. But like so many other high-tech American solutions, it was ultimately a failure. The North Vietnamese and their allies were masters of improvisation and repair. They had thousands of workers, many of them women and young volunteers, who would swarm over a washed-out section of road and have it repaired in a matter of hours. Operation Popeye never came close to shutting down the trail. But its tactical failure is irrelevant compared to its philosophical significance. Operation Ranch Hand and Operation Popeye were two sides of the same coin of ecological warfare. One program sought to remove nature from the battlefield by killing it. The other sought to conscript nature into the armed forces by controlling it. Both were born from a uniquely American technological optimism, a dangerous faith that any problem, no matter how complex, could be solved with enough ingenuity and resources. It was a worldview that saw the environment not as a complex, interconnected system to be respected, but as a machine to be hacked. The jungle, the soil, the rain, the clouds, it was all just terrain, another set of variables in a war-fighting computer simulation. The ultimate legacy of Project Popeye is the precedent it shattered. When the program was eventually exposed by investigative journalist Jack Anderson in 1971, the international outrage was so great that it led directly to the 1977 Environmental Modification Convention, or ENMOD, the first international treaty to ban weather warfare. But the treaty was a reaction to a terrifying reality that Popeye had already proven. The weaponization of the environment was no longer theoretical. The secret missions over Laos had opened Pandora's box and showed that the same mindset that could justify poisoning a forest could just as easily justify weaponizing the sky. This breathtaking arrogance, this belief that the very laws of nature were subject to military revision, was not confined to the skies over Laos. It was an ideology that permeated the entire war effort, and it was enabled by a dirty terrestrial reality. The godlike power to command the rain and kill the forests was born in the grimy, hazardous confines of chemical plants back on American soil places, where the poison was not a distant aerosolized mist, but a daily industrial threat. And just as in Vietnam, the casualties of this domestic chemical war were seen as an acceptable and even useful cost of doing business. The year is 1969. Public debate over the herbicide program is starting to reach a fever pitch. The bionetics study is finally beginning to leak out to the wider scientific community. And at a Monsanto chemical plant near Galveston, Texas, the company is still running its 2.4.5T production lines hot, churning out Agent Orange to meet the Pentagon's insatiable demand. And then history repeats itself. A chemical reactor overheats. A safety valve fails. A runaway reaction blows and dozens of workers are showered in a toxic cloud of 2.45 trichlorophenol and its inevitable, deadly passenger, TCDD. For the workers on the factory floor, the aftermath was a terrifying replay of the Nitro, West Virginia disaster 20 years earlier. First came the nausea and headaches, then came the skin. Horrific, disfiguring lesions erupted across their bodies. It was chloracin, the unmistakable fingerprint of dioxin. But for the executives and doctors at Monsanto headquarters, the reaction was very different. This was not a moment of panic. It was a moment of opportunity. By 1969, they were no longer amateurs in the art of the chemical cover-up. They were seasoned professionals. They knew exactly what they were dealing with, and more importantly, they knew exactly how to use it to their advantage. The company immediately locked the situation down. They took control of the medical response, ensuring that the affected workers were seen by company doctors, not independent physicians. They managed all public communication, framing the event as a minor industrial mishap with no long-term health implications. But behind the scenes, a colder, more calculating strategy was taking shape. The legal and medical departments at Monsanto realized that the Galveston incident had provided them with something of immense value, a fresh set of human guinea pigs. The survivors of the 1949 nitro explosion were a useful data set, but they were getting old. Their exposure was to a slightly different earlier production process. But the Galveston workers, they were a pristine cohort. They had been exposed in the modern era to the exact chemical formulation that was currently at the center of the raging Agent Orange controversy. Their bodies contained the answers to questions that would be worth billions of dollars in future lawsuits. And Monsanto owned the data. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative memo from Monsanto's chief medical director to the corporate legal department, 1970. Subject: long-term follow-up plan for Galveston plant personnel. The recent incident at the Galveston facility, while unfortunate from an operational standpoint, presents us with a unique and valuable opportunity. The affected employees constitute a well-defined epidemiological cohort with a clear, high-dose exposure event. A rigorous long-term medical surveillance program will allow us to gather invaluable data on the chronic human effects of TCDD exposure. This data will be critical in the coming years as we face litigation from veterans groups. This cohort can serve as our own internal, proprietary baseline to counter the more extreme and emotional claims of harm we are anticipating. By controlling the study and the data, we can shape the scientific narrative around dioxin for decades. These workers are, in a very real sense, a key to our legal defense. A key to our legal defense. A group of tragically poisoned men were transformed by a corporate memo into a litigation asset. Monsanto initiated another secret, long-term study, just as they had at Nitro. They meticulously tracked the health of every exposed worker. Every case of cancer, every heart attack, every child born with a birth defect was a data point that flowed into a locked corporate archive. This information was a weapon. If the data suggested a strong link to a disease, it could be buried. If the data was ambiguous, it could be spun and published in a friendly journal to create doubt. Contrast this with the situation facing a Vietnam veteran in the 1970s. He is sick. He believes he was poisoned by Agent Orange, but he has no proof. He cannot quantify his exposure. He has no access to the classified military spray records. And when he goes to court, he is confronted by a team of corporate lawyers from Monsanto armed with a mountain of proprietary scientific data harvested from the bodies of the Galveston workers, that supposedly proves his illness has nothing to do with their product. He is fighting an enemy who not only manufactured the poison, but who also owns the only human studies on its effects. It was a legal battle that was almost impossible to win. The Galveston incident is a perfect, sickening microcosm of how corporate power corrupts science and obstructs justice. The practice of allowing a company to control the health data from its own industrial disasters is a moral abomination. It creates a perverse incentive structure where a human tragedy is seen as a research opportunity. The information that belongs to the public, the data that could save lives and hold the guilty accountable, becomes a trade secret, a proprietary tool for deflecting blame and denying responsibility. The pain and suffering of the Monsanto workers in Texas was not just a tragedy. It was a resource that was mined, refined, and then used as ammunition against another larger group of victims. While Monsanto's executives were weaponizing the suffering of their own workers to build a legal fortress, the United States government was engaged in a different kind of information warfare. Their battlefield was the free press. Their objective was to ensure that the horrific truth unfolding in the Vietnamese countryside never made it to the American breakfast table. The story of Agent Orange is not just a story of a poison, it's the story of a silence, a carefully constructed, brutally enforced silence. And the first casualties of that silence were the journalists who tried to break it. In the Vietnam of the late 1960s, the press corps largely followed the war the military wanted them to see. They were embedded with troops, flown on military helicopters to battle sites, and fed the official narrative at the daily MACV press briefing in Saigon, the infamous 5 o'clock follies. The story was about combat, body counts, and strategy. But a few journalists, the ones who ventured off the beaten path, began to see a different war. They were the reporters and photographers who spent weeks at a time deep in the provinces, who drank tea with village elders and talked to local doctors in makeshift clinics. And they started to hear a recurring, terrifying story. It was a story that always followed the C-123s. A few weeks after the planes came and the jungle turned brown, the villagers would say, the pigs would be born with no heads. The water buffalo would start to die. And then came the babies. The midwives would speak in hushed tones of an epidemic of stillbirths, of infants born with twisted spines, with missing limbs, with their organs on the outside of their bodies. A French-trained doctor in a provincial hospital would show a journalist his records. A chilling spike in miscarriages and specific, grotesque birth defects that had no precedent. These journalists, seasoned and cynical as they were, knew they were onto something huge. A freelance photographer might spend a month documenting these monster babies, capturing images of almost unbearable grief and deformity. A wire service reporter might painstakingly collect dozens of first-hand accounts, cross-referencing them with provincial spray records. They were connecting the dots, seeing the horrifying correlation between the chemical spray and the biological chaos on the ground. They would file their stories, send their undeveloped film canisters on the next flight to New York or London, convinced they were about to expose a scandal of epic proportions. And then, nothing. The story would die in an editor's office thousands of miles away. The photographs would be deemed too gruesome or unsubstantiated. The meticulously reported article would be cut down to a single ambiguous paragraph and buried on page 17, or killed entirely. These journalists slammed into a wall of institutional resistance, a wall built of skepticism, military pressure, and a deep-seated reluctance to believe their own government was capable of such a thing. The Pentagon's public affairs machine was ruthlessly effective. Any query from a news desk about chemical side effects would be met with a calm, authoritative denial. It was all baseless, they'd say, just tragic but common birth defects being exploited by Viet Cong propagandists to undermine the war effort. This official line was then reinforced through quiet, off-the-record conversations with senior editors and publishers, a form of patriotic blackmail. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative phone call between a Pentagon Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs and the national editor of a major newspaper. Look, Bob, between you and me, this stuff about birth defects is pure Hanoi bullshit. We've had our top scientists look at it. The herbicide is the same stuff you use on your dandelions. What you have is a stringer out in the jungle who's getting played by the VC. If you run this story, you're not just giving the enemy a massive propaganda victory. You're retelling the parents of every kid we have over there that their son is part of an atrocity. It's irresponsible. It will kill morale. We're in the middle of a war, for God's sake. You have to think about which side you're on. This isn't the story. Let's talk about the progress we're making in the Delta. Which side you're on. That was the cudgel used to enforce the silence. It wasn't overt censorship. It was a far more effective appeal to responsibility and patriotism. Editors who relied on the military for access and information were profoundly unwilling to go to war with their sources over a story that seemed too horrible to be true. A few brave reporters had their careers stalled. Others simply gave up, filing the stories the editors wanted to buy. The truth managed to leak out only at the margins, in the work of a few foreign journalists, like the brilliant Japanese photographer Kyoichi Sawada, in the pages of small anti-war magazines and in the Vietnamese press, which was of course dismissed as enemy propaganda. The failure of the mainstream media to aggressively pursue the Agent Orange story in the 1960s is one of the great, tragic what-ifs of the war. It represents a colossal breakdown of the institution's primary function: to hold power accountable. The famous credibility gap was not just about the Pentagon lying about enemy body counts. It was about a lie of a much greater magnitude. A lie that allowed a massive, undeclared public health disaster to unfold in plain sight, yet in total darkness. By accepting the official narrative, by choosing access over adversarial truth-telling, the press became an unwitting accomplice to the cover-up. They created the information vacuum that allowed the poison to spread, unchecked and unchallenged for 5 more years. And when the sick veterans finally came home, They returned to a country that had no idea what had been done in its name and in theirs. The wall of silence built by the government, the corporations, and a compliant media was formidable. It was designed to withstand the stories of anonymous peasants and the complaints of low-ranking GIs. But it was not designed to withstand the grief and rage of a four-star admiral. The truth about Agent Orange, suppressed for so long, was about to find its most powerful and tragic witness, a man from the very heart of the military establishment who would be forced to confront the horrific consequences of his own commands. His name was Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt Jr., and he was a legend in the U.S. Navy. Brilliant, innovative, and aggressive, he was a true believer in the American mission in Vietnam. In 1968, he was given command of U.S. naval forces in the country, a sprawling operation that included the Brown Water Navy, the fleet of small patrol boats that plied the treacherous rivers and canals of the Mekong Delta. His sailors were dying at an alarming rate, cut down in bloody ambushes launched from the dense triple canopy jungle that grew right up to the water's edge. Zumwalt was a commander who cared deeply about his men, and he was determined to reduce the casualty rates. He looked at the overgrown riverbanks not as a feature of the landscape, but as a tactical problem to be solved. And the tool he chose to solve it with was Agent Orange. He ordered a massive escalation of defoliation in his operational area, turning the rivers of the Delta into the most heavily sprayed region in all of South Vietnam. C-123s flew mission after mission, drenching the riverbanks in a chemical fog to strip away the enemy's cover. Tactically, it was a logical, even compelling decision. It would save American lives, and among the young men whose lives he was trying to save, serving bravely as the commander of a patrol boat in the heart of the Delta, was a 22-year-old lieutenant. His name was Elmo Zumwalt III. He was the admiral's son. Young Elmo was constantly on patrol in the very waterways being saturated by the chemicals his father was ordering from the sky. The spray would drift over his boat. He would swim in the contaminated water. He and his crew would drink it after running it through primitive purifiers. They were living in a toxic soup, created by a command decision made by the lieutenant's own father. The war ended. The father went on to become the youngest ever chief of naval operations, the highest-ranking officer in the Navy. The son came home, went to law school, married, and had a child. The Zumwalts were the epitome of a proud, successful military family. Then, in 1983, the bill for that tactical decision in the Mekong Delta came due. Elmo Zumwalt III was diagnosed with not one, but two aggressive cancers, lymphoma and Hodgkin's disease. As the younger Zumwalt's body was ravaged by the disease and the brutal chemotherapy used to fight it, both father and son came to a slow, agonizing conclusion. The cause was Agent Orange. They were not quiet about their conviction. In an act of incredible courage, they decided to tell their story to the world, co-authoring a book titled My Father, My Son. The book is a harrowing, intimate account of a son's fight for life and a father's reckoning with his own role in his child's fate. It contains perhaps the most powerful and damning confession ever made by a senior officer of the Vietnam War. Uncomfortable, quote, from Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt Jr., in My Father, My Son. I know what you are thinking, and you are right. There is no denying the terrible irony that I, who ordered the spraying of Agent Orange, may have caused my son's illness. I've come to realize that the book's title has a triple meaning. As a father, I was and am enormously proud of Elmo. As a military commander, I was his commander in a chain of command that went from the President of the United States to the sailor on the firing line. And knowing what I now know, I am still not sure that I would have acted differently then. But I am sure of this. Elmo's bravery and the bravery of the thousands of young men who served in Vietnam are a rebuke to the safe and easy patriotism of those who sent them to war. And the fact that our country has not acknowledged its debt to those who returned from Vietnam, bearing the special burdens of that war, is a national disgrace. This was a bombshell. For a man of Zumwalt's stature and reputation to publicly link his son's cancer to Agent Orange was an act that shattered the official narrative. The government could dismiss disgruntled veterans as malcontents, but they could not dismiss the former head of the U.S. Navy. Admiral Zumwalt became the most credible and powerful advocate the veterans had. He used his prestige, his connections, and his still powerful voice to lobby Congress, to testify at hearings, and to demand that the government acknowledge the truth and compensate the victims. He transformed his personal agony into a public crusade. The story of the Zumwalts is a tragedy of almost mythic proportions, a story of a father who, in trying to protect his son from the enemy's bullets, exposed him to a far more insidious poison of his own making. It is the ultimate, horrifying metaphor for the nature of chemical warfare. The poison doesn't care about flags or uniforms. It doesn't distinguish between the enemy and the son of the man who commands the fleet. The tactical logic that made perfect sense on a battle map in 1968 dissolved into a personal nightmare in a cancer ward in 1985. Admiral Zumwalt A.'s tragic reversal proved in the most intimate and heartbreaking way possible that the chemical weapons you deploy in a foreign land will always in the end find a way to come home and claim your own. The tragic, high-profile story of the Zumwalt family was a turning point. It personalized the scandal, giving it a face the establishment could not ignore. Combined with the mounting scientific evidence, the growing media scrutiny, and the relentless international pressure, the wall of official denial, once impregnable, began to crumble. By 1970, the Nixon administration, already struggling to manage an unpopular war and a restive populace, came to a cold, pragmatic conclusion. Operation Ranch Hand was no longer worth the trouble. The end did not come as a sudden moral epiphany. It came as a slow, reluctant political calculation. The scientific dam had broken. In December 1969, the American Association for the Advancement of Science held a symposium where the bionetic study was publicly discussed in detail, and scientists who had visited Vietnam presented devastating evidence of ecocide. The story was now out of the Pentagon's control and in the pages of scientific journals. The harmless herbicide narrative was dead. The White House was being bombarded with questions from a press corps that was finally waking up to the scandal. Simultaneously, the strategic logic of the war was changing. The policy of Vietnamization was in full swing, with American ground troops beginning their slow withdrawal. The idea of clearing jungle for large-scale U.S. search and destroy missions was becoming obsolete. The program, which cost tens of millions of dollars a year, was starting to look like a poor investment with diminishing returns. It was becoming a political albatross, a symbol of the American war machine's indiscriminate brutality, at the very moment President Nixon wanted to project an image of a steady, honorable disengagement. The decision to end the program was not a debate about right and wrong. It was a cost-benefit analysis, where the cost was measured in newspaper headlines and diplomatic protests, and the benefit was a tactical advantage that was shrinking by the day. Uncomfortable, quote, from a fictionalized but representative National Security Council options memo to President Nixon, early 1970. Subject: Review of Herbicide Program, Operation Ranch Hand. Mr. President, the political costs associated with Operation Ranch Hand now significantly outweigh its diminishing military utility. The recent scientific reports and subsequent negative press have created a sustained diplomatic and public relations crisis. Continued large-scale use of these agents will further fuel domestic anti-war sentiment and alienate key international allies. While MACV continues to assert the program's value, from a strategic perspective, its termination would provide a low-cost way to signal a de-escalation of controversial tactics as part of the broader Vietnamization narrative. We can absorb the minor tactical disadvantages. We can no longer absorb the political damage. We recommend an immediate suspension, to be followed by a quiet phase-out. And so, the end came, not with a bang, but with a press release. In April of 1970, the Pentagon announced a temporary hold on the use of Agent Orange. Other agents, like White and Blue, continued to be used for a few more months. The final official Ranch Hand defoliation mission was flown on January 7, 1971. The operation, after nearly a decade of relentless spraying, was over. But the poison remained. The end of the spraying did not magically vanish the massive stockpiles of chemicals that the U.S. military had amassed in Southeast Asia. At sprawling air bases like Bien Hoa and Da Nang in Vietnam, and at storage depots as far away as Clark Air Base in the Philippines, a new and terrifying problem was emerging. There were vast fields, some covering acres of land, stacked high with 55-gallon drums of Agent Orange, tens of thousands of them, containing a grand total of more than 2.2 million gallons of the now infamous chemical. These were not high-tech containment vessels. They were thin steel drums designed for transport and immediate use, not for long-term storage in a sweltering tropical climate. Under the relentless sun and torrential rains, they began to corrode. Forklifts had dented and punctured them. Seals had failed, and slowly at first, then with increasing frequency, they began to leak. Oily, toxic rivulets of poison began to seep out, pooling on the ground and soaking deep into the red soil of the military bases. The United States military was now in the hazardous waste business. They were the custodians of millions of gallons of a substance they now privately knew to be contaminated with a supertoxin, a proven teratogen. The political firestorm at home meant they couldn't just ship it back to the ports of Oakland or New Jersey. The official termination of the program meant they could no longer spray it on the jungle. They were stuck with a toxic legacy, sitting in rusting barrels in the middle of a country they were trying to leave. This is the profound, cynical lie of the program's end. The official termination was not an act of responsibility. It was an act of abandonment. It simply marked the moment the chemical war shifted from a war of dispersal to a war of concentration. The vast, toxic footprint of Agent Orange, once spread thinly across millions of acres, was now being concentrated in a few specific locations. These former U.S. bases would become known as hotspots, pockets of land so saturated with dioxin that they would remain deadly for generations. The end of Operation Ranch Hand was not a cleanup. It was the quiet, deliberate creation of a series of permanent chemical landmines, left to tick away in the soil of a nation we had already ravaged. The leaking barrels of Agent Orange, sitting in the sweltering heat of the Bien Hoa Air Base, were more than just a hazardous waste problem. They were a political time bomb. Each corroding drum was a 55-gallon container of evidence, a physical testament to a program the U.S. government now desperately wanted the world to forget. With American troops withdrawing, the last thing the Nixon administration wanted was for the North Vietnamese to capture a massive stockpile of this controversial chemical and parade it before the world's media. The evidence had to disappear. This imperative gave birth to Operation Pacer Ivy, one of the largest and most hazardous logistical operations of the post-war cleanup. Launched in 1972, its mission was simple: remove every last drop of Agent Orange from South Vietnam. But the execution was a toxic nightmare. American crews, often wearing little more than standard fatigues, were tasked with rounding up over 200,000 disintegrating barrels from storage yards across the country. They waded through soil that was black and sticky with leaking poison, wrestling the heavy, corroded drums onto trucks and planes. It was a brutal, dangerous job, a race against time and rust. The destination for this river of poison was a place meant to be forgotten: Johnston Atoll, a tiny, isolated coral island in the Central Pacific, 1,000 miles from anywhere that mattered. It was the U.S. military's designated closet for its most dangerous skeletons, already home to a massive depot of aging chemical weapons and nerve gas. It was the perfect place to hide something you never wanted to see again. No press, no protesters, no prying eyes. In 1972, a ship carrying the first massive consignment of Agent Orange from Vietnam arrived, and the island became the world's largest dioxin storage facility. But this only solved half the problem. Now, instead of leaking into the soil of Vietnam, the barrels were leaking into the fragile coral ecosystem of a Pacific atoll. The Air Force, now the reluctant owner of 2.2 million gallons of poison, needed a permanent disposal solution. They couldn't bury it, as it would leach into the island's freshwater lens. Building a sophisticated, environmentally safe incinerator on the remote island would be astronomically expensive and take years. They needed a faster, cheaper, and above all, more discreet option. They needed to make the problem vanish over the horizon. The solution they found was a Dutch-owned ship called the MT Vulcanus. It was one of the world's first at-sea incineration vessels, essentially a floating blast furnace. The plan, codenamed Operation Pacer HO, was to load the Agent Orange from the barrels on Johnston Atoll onto the Vulcanus. sail the ship to a remote, designated patch of the Pacific Ocean, and burn it. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative Department of Defense Logistics Directive for Operation Pacer IV, 1972. Subject, disposition of herbicide orange, HO, stockpiles. The primary objective is the complete removal of all HO assets from the former theater of operations with minimal public visibility. Johnston Atoll is designated as the interim consolidation point due to its secure nature and lack of external oversight. For final disposition at sea, incineration is identified as the path of least political resistance. This method avoids the lengthy environmental impact studies and potential legal challenges associated with domestic or on-island disposal. The operational priority is the timely and quiet elimination of this politically sensitive material. The path of least political resistance. That was the real mission. In the summer of 1977, over 3 separate voyages, the Vulcanus did its work. It sailed to a lonely spot 1,000 miles west of Hawaii. The toxic contents of the rusting drums were pumped into its twin incinerators, which burned at over 200 degrees Celsius. For weeks on end, a plume of smoke and superheated gas billowed from its smokestacks, carrying the incinerated remnants of Agent Orange out over the vast, empty ocean. The Air Force declared the operation a resounding success, claiming that over 99.9% of the dioxin had been safely destroyed. But this was a claim based on faith in technology, not on empirical evidence. What exactly was in that plume? Was the dioxin truly broken down into harmless components, or was it simply scattered in microscopic, still dangerous particles across thousands of square miles of the Pacific? What was the effect on the oceanic food chain, on the delicate ecosystem of the planet's largest ocean? No one knew. No one checked. The entire operation was an exercise in the fundamental philosophy of modern pollution. The solution to pollution is dilution. This is the ultimate shell game. The end of Operation Ranch Hand wasn't a cleanup. It was a relocation. The problem was moved from the jungles of Vietnam to a tiny island, and then finally displaced again, smeared into the atmosphere over the Pacific. It was a profound refusal to take responsibility, an act of global-scale littering. By burning the evidence in the middle of nowhere, the Pentagon was able to close the book on Agent Orange. They could finally say the chemical was gone, but it wasn't gone. It had just been transformed. Its curse changed from a concentrated poison on the land to a diffuse, invisible specter in the air and water. It was the final, cynical act in the cover-up, an attempt to erase a war crime by dissolving it into the planet itself. While the last of the Agent Orange was being turned into an invisible plume of gas over the Pacific Ocean, its ghost was coming home to roost. The military's vast, expensive effort to erase the physical evidence of the chemical was a desperate attempt to close a chapter of history. But the poison had already been sown, not just in the soil of Vietnam, but in the cells of the men and women who had fought there. And as they returned to a country eager to forget the war, a new, silent, and deeply personal battle was just beginning. They came home in the late 1960s and early 1970s, trying to slot back into a world that no longer seemed to fit. They got jobs, they got married, they started families. They tried to put the jungle behind them. Then, a few years later, the whispers started. A strange, unshakable fatigue. A persistent skin rash that looked like severe acne. A sudden, terrifying cancer diagnosis. These were men in their late 20s and 30s, in the prime of their lives, being struck down by diseases that normally afflict the elderly. Soft tissue sarcomas, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Hodgkin's disease, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Their wives were suffering multiple miscarriages. Their children were being born with devastating birth defects like spina bifida. At first, they were just isolated tragedies, cruel twists of fate. But in the VFW halls, in the local bars, in the first tentative veterans support groups, the stories began to connect. Men who had served together in I Corps, who remembered the daily C-123 flights that blotted out the sun, were discovering they now shared the same rare cancer. A common thread began to emerge from the litany of suffering, the memory of a sweet chemical smell, and the sight of a dying landscape. They didn't have the scientific proof, but in their bones, they knew. It was the spray. It was Agent Orange. So they did what they were told to do. They went to the Department of Veterans Affairs, the sprawling government institution whose solemn promise was to care for him who shall have borne the battle. They filed claims. They asked for help. They looked for answers. And they walked straight into a bureaucratic wall of cold, methodical denial. The VA's position was simple, unified, and unyielding. There was no proven scientific link between exposure to herbicides and their illnesses. The cancers were a coincidence. The birth defects were a tragedy, but unrelated to military service. Claim after claim was denied. To get benefits, the VA told them, a veteran had to prove two things: that he was sick with a specific disease, and that his sickness was a direct result of his exposure to Agent Orange. This created a demonic catch-22. Proving the sickness was easy. The tumors were on the X-rays. Proving the exposure was made deliberately impossible. The military's own records of the spray missions were often classified, disorganized, or had been mysteriously lost in a fire. How could a 19-year-old rifleman from 1968 possibly prove the exact coordinates of his patrol on the exact day a plane flew overhead? The VA knew he couldn't. The entire system was a fortress, designed to keep them out. This policy was not the result of scientific skepticism. It was a calculated strategy of cost containment, a decision made at the highest levels to protect the U.S. Treasury from a liability that could run into the billions. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative internal VA General Counsel memo, circa 1979. Subject: Adjudication Policy for Herbicide-Related Disability. Claims. All claims adjudicators are to be reminded that the burden of proof for establishing a direct service connection for these Agent Orange claims rests solely with the veteran. Lacking definitive peer-reviewed scientific consensus on causality, the official agency position is to deny such a connection. We must vigorously resist any attempts to establish a presumptive link between service in Vietnam and any specific disease. Granting claims based on anecdotal or correlational evidence would set a fiscally catastrophic precedent and open the floodgates for potentially hundreds of thousands of unsubstantiated claims. Our mandate is to adhere to the strictest possible interpretation of the existing statutes. Compassion is not a compensable disability. Compassion is not a compensable disability. This was more than just bureaucratic stonewalling. It was a systematic campaign of institutional gaslighting. The VA took a generation of men who were already struggling with the psychological trauma of war and the physical trauma of disease, and told them that their reality was a delusion. They were told their own memories were wrong, their own suffering was imagined. It was a profound psychological assault, a denial not just of benefits but of their very experience. This was the final betrayal. These men had served their country in a brutal and unpopular war. They had been sprayed with a poison they were assured was harmless. They had been welcomed home with indifference or hostility. And now, as they were dying, the very government they had fought for was calling them liars. This cynical, calculated denial created a wound far deeper than any bullet could. It severed the sacred trust between the soldier and the state. For tens of thousands of veterans, the war didn't end in the jungles of Vietnam. It simply moved into the cold, fluorescent-lit hallways of a VA hospital where they would spend the rest of their lives fighting a new and unwinnable war, this time against their own government. Into this hopeless battle, this war of attrition between dying veterans and an implacable government bureaucracy, stepped an unlikely champion. He was not a long-haired protester or a radical firebrand. He was Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon, a respected, soft-spoken, and deeply religious Republican. A decorated veteran of the amphibious landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, he was a pillar of the very establishment that was perpetuating the cover-up, and he was about to use his power to launch a direct assault on the wall of denial. Hatfield's crusade began not with ideology but with constituent services. He started receiving letters and calls from veterans in Oregon, men telling the same nightmarish story of strange illnesses and rejected VA claims. A man of profound moral conviction, Hatfield was moved and disturbed. He began to dig, And the more he dug, the more he became convinced that the veterans were telling the truth, and that the government, his government, was engaged in a systematic deception. He quickly realized the futility of trying to work through the official channels. The VA, the Department of Defense, and the White House had all circled the wagons, commissioning their own slow-moving, multi-year, multi-million-dollar epidemiological studies that were clearly designed to delay, not to discover. They controlled the official scientific narrative. So Hatfield, a shrewd and powerful member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, decided to create his own. He used his authority to bypass the bureaucracy and fund a series of independent scientific symposia and reports bringing in top-tier unimpeachable scientists from institutions like Harvard and Yale to review the evidence the VA was so determined to ignore. The results, which came to be known as the Hatfield Papers, were a series of bombshells dropped throughout the early 1980s. Scientists like the renowned Harvard biologist Dr. Matthew Meselson methodically dismantled the official government position. They analyzed international studies from industrial accidents. They reviewed the toxicology of dioxin. They looked at the distinct pattern of rare diseases emerging in the veteran population, and their conclusions were unequivocal. They stated in the sober, careful language of science that there was a strong and plausible causal link between exposure to dioxin-contaminated herbicides and the cancers, nerve damage, and other illnesses that were devastating the veteran community. For the first time, a U.S. government-funded body had officially validated the veterans' claims. The establishment's reaction was immediate and ferocious. This was a direct threat to the entire architecture of denial, and it had to be destroyed. The VA, the Air Force, and the PR arms of the chemical industry launched a coordinated public campaign to discredit Hatfield and his findings. Government-funded scientists were sent before the press to attack the Hatfield Papers as unscientific, biased, and politically motivated. They were dismissed as the work of a rogue senator and his hand-picked alarmist researchers. The official line was that only the government's own massive long-term study, the Air Force's so-called Ranch Hand 2 study of the pilots and crew who did the spraying, could provide the definitive answers. It was a classic delay tactic, portraying methodical caution while privately scrambling to control their own damning data. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative internal Air Force memo regarding the Ranch Hand 2 study, 1983. Subject, preliminary data analysis and external communication strategy. The early crosstabs on the Ranch Hand cohort are showing a statistically significant and frankly troubling correlation between dioxin serum levels and the incidence of certain carcinomas, consistent with some of the more alarmist claims from the Hatfield reports. This presents a significant political and legal challenge. It is imperative that we slow walk the release of any findings. Our public posture must be to emphasize the complexity of the data and the need for years of further peer review. We must not, under any circumstances, allow our preliminary data to be seen as a confirmation of Hatfield's work. We need to control the narrative, and that means controlling the timeline. Control the narrative. This was the entire game. By publicly attacking Hatfield's science while privately seeing their own data trend in the same direction, the government was engaged in a breathtaking act of bad faith. They successfully framed the issue in the media as a complex scientific debate with experts on both sides. This manufactured controversy created the illusion of uncertainty, giving the VA the political cover it needed to continue its policy of mass denial. They could now tell a veteran, a judge, or a congressman, the science is still unsettled. We must wait for the definitive results. The meta-commentary here is a lesson in the weaponization of science itself. The campaign against Senator Hatfield demonstrates what happens when scientific inquiry collides with immense political and financial liability. The goal of the powerful is no longer to discern the truth, but to manage it. They achieve this by creating a doubt industry. They fund their own research, not to find answers, but to produce results that can be used to question the answers found by others. They use the very vocabulary of science, words like rigor, methodology, and peer review, as a smokescreen, a tool to bog down the process in an endless, paralyzing debate. Senator Hatfield brought forward the facts, backed by some of the best scientific minds in the country. The government's response was not to refute the facts, but to declare that the very nature of truth was still up for debate. It was a cynical, brilliant strategy that purchased them years of impunity, while thousands more veterans got sick, got tired, and died waiting for the definitive science their own government was doing everything in its power to sabotage. While Senator Hatfield was fighting a lonely battle in the halls of Congress, the veterans themselves were opening a new front in the war for truth. Stonewalled by the VA and discredited by the official science, they turned to the last resort in the American system: the courts. If the government wouldn't hold itself accountable, perhaps a jury of their peers would hold the corporations accountable. What followed was one of the largest and most consequential legal battles of the 20th century, a battle that promised a final, public reckoning and delivered instead a final, bitter betrayal. The lawsuit was officially known as INRI, Agent Orange Product Liability Litigation, a dry legal title for a case that encompassed a generation of pain. It was a massive class-action lawsuit, consolidating the claims of thousands of sick veterans against the 7 chemical companies that had manufactured the herbicides: Dow, Monsanto, Diamond Shamrock, Hercules, Uniroyal, TH Agricultural, and Thompson. It was a legal David versus Goliath, a loose consortium of veterans, advocates, and trial lawyers against a united front of corporate Goliaths with their infinite legal budgets and armies of attorneys. The chemical companies came to court armed with a powerful and elegant legal shield: the government contractor defense. Their argument was simple: we were merely contractors fulfilling an order. The US government gave us the recipe, they set the production deadlines, and they used the product as they saw fit. We were, in essence, just soldiers in the industrial war effort. If anyone is liable, it is the government itself. It was a brilliant strategy, designed to shift all blame onto an entity, the federal government, that could not be effectively sued by its own soldiers for injuries incurred during wartime, thanks to a legal principle known as the Ferris Doctrine. For years, the legal battle raged. Lawyers took thousands of depositions. They filed millions of pages of documents. And slowly, the veterans' legal team began to make headway. They started to unearth the damning internal memos, the buried studies, the evidence of Monsanto's secret knowledge from the Nitro and Galveston accidents. It became clear that the company's claim of being ignorant contractors was a lie. They knew about the dioxin. They knew about its toxicity. A public jury trial seemed imminent. For the veterans, it was the moment they had been fighting for: a chance to finally present their evidence in open court, to force Monsanto and Dow executives onto the witness stand and have them answer for their actions under oath. Then, on the very eve of the trial in May 1984, the presiding judge, Jack B. Weinstein, intervened. Fearing a messy, protracted, and unpredictable trial, he pushed both sides relentlessly towards a settlement. In a marathon, around-the-clock negotiation session, a deal was struck. At dawn on May 7th, the lawyers announced that the chemical companies had agreed to create a settlement fund of $180 million. The headlines trumpeted it as a historic victory for the veterans. It was anything but. The settlement was a masterpiece of corporate cynicism. First, the money. While $180 million sounds like a vast sum, it was a pittance when spread across the enormous class of affected veterans. After legal fees, the fund was to be distributed over 10 years to tens of thousands of claimants. But the most critical part of the deal was not the dollar amount. It was the fine print. The companies admitted no fault. The settlement explicitly stated that the payment was not an admission of liability, but rather a compassionate gesture to end the litigation. By signing the deal, the veterans and their families were barred from ever suing the companies again. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative internal victory memo from the lead defense counsel to the CEO of a defendant chemical company. Subject, Agent Orange litigation, final resolution. This is an unqualified victory. The $180 million figure is a rounding error on our annual revenue, a fraction of what a single lost verdict could have cost us in punitive damages. More importantly, we have achieved all of our strategic objectives. The no liability clause means we have admitted nothing and set no legal precedent. We have avoided a public trial where our internal research and development documents would have been subject to hostile cross-examination. We have effectively capped our entire Agent Orange liability for what amounts to a modest, tax-deductible business expense. We have purchased total and permanent peace from the veteran issue at a bargain price. Total and permanent peace at a bargain price. For the veterans, the reaction was one of shock and profound betrayal. They had not endured years of illness and legal struggle for a check that wouldn't even cover their rent. They had fought for justice. They had fought for accountability. They wanted a verdict that said, "What you did was wrong. You knew your product was poison and you sold it anyway." The settlement denied them this. It allowed the chemical companies to walk away with their secrets intact and their reputation laundered, having purchased their innocence for a few cents on the dollar. The 1984 settlement stands as a grim lesson in the realities of the American justice system. It demonstrates how the preference for expediency and out-of-court deals can serve to protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless. The settlement short-circuited the truth. It ensured that the full story of corporate malfeasance, of the buried studies and the manipulated data, would remain hidden from the public record for years to come. It was a legal maneuver that provided a pittance of compensation in exchange for a pound of silence, leaving the veterans with a handful of cash and a permanent gaping wound where justice was supposed to be. The 1984 class action settlement was not an end for the chemical companies. It was a beginning. They had successfully purchased a legal peace, capping their financial liability for a pittance. But the court of public opinion was another matter. The name Agent Orange had become synonymous with poison, and its contaminant, dioxin, was being branded by scientists and the media as the most toxic molecule ever synthesized. This was a public relations disaster that threatened not just their reputations, but their entire multi-billion-dollar portfolio of chlorinated chemical products. A legal victory was not enough. They needed to win the war of the narrative. They needed to rehabilitate the image of dioxin itself. Leading this audacious new offensive was Dow Chemical. While Monsanto had often been the public face of the legal fight, Dow pioneered the sophisticated, multi-front public relations war that would define the next decade. Their strategy was not simply to deny the past, but to actively reshape the present scientific and political reality. It was a campaign of breathtaking scope and cynicism, designed to transform dioxin from a terrifying supertoxin into a misunderstood and manageable industrial chemical. The campaign was waged on three fronts. First, they went after the science. Dow poured millions of dollars into toxicology programs at universities across the country, funding research that was, shall we say, predisposed to reach conclusions favorable to the company's position. They sponsored studies designed to emphasize the high doses needed for acute effects in animals, while conveniently ignoring or downplaying the long-term, low-dose effects like cancer and birth defects in humans. Second, they went after the politicians. An army of Dow lobbyists descended on Washington to fight the new wave of environmental regulation that was emerging in the 1980s. They aggressively targeted the EPA and fought to weaken the standards for dioxin cleanup under the new Superfund law, arguing that the existing science was junk science and that overly stringent regulations would cripple American industry and cost jobs. But the third and most insidious front was the war for the public mind. To wage this war, Dow's Public Affairs Division created their master weapon, an internal guidebook, a Bible of misinformation that came to be known as the Dioxin Dossier. This was not a crude pamphlet of talking points. It was a sophisticated, comprehensive manual that armed every Dow executive, scientist, and spokesperson with a curated set of arguments, misleading analogies, and decontextualized data, all designed to systematically diffuse public anxiety and disarm journalists. It was a complete, pre-packaged alternate reality. The dossier taught a masterclass in the art of semantic manipulation and risk minimization. It was filled with techniques to trivialize the danger of their product by comparing it to familiar, everyday risks. This was the playbook. Acknowledge a kernel of truth, chloroquine, to establish credibility, then immediately pivot to a series of misleading comparisons that make the larger fear seem irrational. It was brilliant, and it was devastatingly effective. Armed with these talking points, Dow representatives fanned out, appearing on television, giving interviews, and publishing op-eds. They were calm, reasonable, and spoke the language of science. They relentlessly hammered the same message. Dioxin is a misunderstood chemical. The controversy is a media-driven hysteria. The real science shows the risk is minimal. All the while this PR campaign was in full swing, the real-world consequences of dioxin contamination were undeniable. The entire town of Times Beach, Missouri, was being permanently evacuated because its roads had been sprayed with dioxin-laced oil. The Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls was a festering toxic wound. The disconnect between Dow's polished narrative and the lived reality of poisoned American communities was staggering. The Dow dioxin dossier and the campaign it fueled represent the perfection of corporate information warfare. It marked the evolution of propaganda from simple denial to the active manufacturing of a parallel scientific universe. This strategy does more than just muddy the waters on a single issue. It has a profoundly corrosive effect on society itself. It teaches the public that science is not a process of discovery, but a tool of advocacy. It blurs the line between fact and spin to such a degree that the average citizen is left bewildered, unable to trust any source of information, be it scientific, governmental, or journalistic. Dow's ultimate goal was not just to win the argument about dioxin safety, it was to poison the very well of public discourse, creating a world so steeped in manufactured doubt that the concept of objective corporate guilt would become impossible to prove. While Dow Chemical AS public relations machine was working overtime in the United States to convince the public that dioxin was a manageable, misunderstood chemical, a horrifying real-world experiment was playing out in the towns and villages of post-war Vietnam. Here, there was no sophisticated dossier to spin the facts, no army of lobbyists to muddy the scientific waters. There was only the raw, undeniable, and enduring truth of the poison. For the people of Vietnam, the war never ended. It simply seeped into their soil, their water, and their DNA. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, Vietnam was largely cut off from the West. A punitive U.S. trade embargo isolated the nation, and for decades the ongoing human cost of the chemical war was a story that unfolded in the dark, invisible to the world. The narrative in America was focused on the plight of its own veterans. The primary victims, the people who had lived under the chemical rain for a decade, were forgotten. As the years turned into decades, a strange and disturbing pattern emerged. While some of the sprayed jungle areas began a slow, pained recovery, certain pockets of land remained stubbornly, unnaturally barren. These were the former U.S. military bases, the logistical hubs of Operation Ranch Hand, particularly the airfields at Bien Hoa, Da Nang, and Phuket. These were the places where the hundreds of thousands of barrels of Agent Orange had been stored, where the planes were loaded, where the leaky equipment was washed down. These were the sites of the massive spills, where the contents of countless corroding drums had bled directly into the earth. These locations became known by a new, chilling name: hotspots. They are among the most contaminated places on the face of the planet. Scientific surveys conducted decades after the war have found TCDD dioxin levels in the soil and lake sediment of these areas that are hundreds, and in some cases more than 1,000 times higher than any internationally recognized safe health threshold. These are not merely contaminated sites, they are massive, unfenced toxic waste dumps, and for 50 years impoverished Vietnamese communities have been living on top of them. The horror is in the invisible cycle of contamination. Families built their homes on the edges of the former bases. Their children played in the contaminated dirt. They drew their water from wells sunk into poisoned aquifers. And crucially, they fished for their dinner in the base's ponds and lakes. Dioxin, being heavy and fat-soluble, settles into the sediment at the bottom of these lakes. It is absorbed by bottom-feeding fish and shrimp, bioaccumulating in their fatty tissues. A fisherman catches a fish, brings it home, and feeds his pregnant wife. The poison is passed from the soil of the American base to the fish in the lake, to the mother, and across the placenta into the developing cells of her unborn child. The result is a multi-generational plague. The hotspots and their surrounding villages have become epicenters of a public health catastrophe. They have rates of cancer and immune deficiency diseases that are far above the national average. But the most visible and heartbreaking legacy is written in the bodies of the children. For 3 and now heading into 4 generations, these communities have seen a horrifyingly high incidence of the same signature birth defects: severe spinal deformities, missing or misshapen limbs, profound mental disabilities. There are special villages, often called peace villages, that are little more than orphanages filled with the victims, a living museum of the chemical's enduring power to maim. Uncomfortable, quote. From a fictionalized but representative statement by a senior doctor at a Da Nang maternity hospital. Every week I deliver a new baby with a familiar kind of damage: the spine that is not closed, the head that is filled with water, the limbs that are not there. The parents are young. They were born 10, 15 years after the last American soldier left. Their parents, the grandparents of this baby, were just children during the war. But the poison does not care about calendars. It is passed down. It is in the mother's milk. It is in the father's blood. We are not just fighting a disease. We are fighting a curse that is woven into the very fabric of our families. We are watching the war be reborn, again and again, in the bodies of our children. For decades, the official position of the United States government was to deny any responsibility. They refused to even acknowledge the health effects, let alone fund a cleanup. It was, they claimed, a problem for the Vietnamese government to solve. Only in the 21st century, faced with irrefutable scientific proof and mounting international pressure, did the U.S. finally begin to provide token amounts of funding for remediation efforts, a sum that is a microscopic fraction of what was spent to create the problem in the first place. This is the ultimate damning consequence of waging a chemical war and then simply walking away. The uncleaned hotspots of Vietnam are the chemical equivalent of leaving millions of unexploded cluster bombs scattered across a country. They are weapons that continue to wound and kill decades after the peace treaty is signed. The ghost cancers and the cursed earth of Vietnam are a permanent testament to a profound moral failure, a refusal by one of the richest nations on earth to clean up the poison it left behind in one of the poorest. It is a war that continues to claim new victims every single day, a silent, relentless conflict waged by a long-departed army against a generation that has never known a day of peace from its effects. The curse that was born in the laboratories of Dow and Monsanto, the curse that was passed down through the generations in the villages of Vietnam, did not spare the place that was supposed to be its tomb. The US government's solution for making its poison disappear was to ship it to a forgotten speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But the poison refused to be forgotten. Johnston Atoll, the remote island prison for Agent Orange, would become a victim itself, a permanent toxic sacrifice to the god of plausible deniability. When we last visited Johnston Atoll, it was 1977, and the incinerator ship Vulcanus was sailing over the horizon, leaving a trail of dioxin-laced smoke in its wake. The official story was that the problem had been solved. The last of the Agent Orange from Vietnam had been cleanly destroyed. This was, like so much of the official story, a carefully constructed lie. The Vulcanus operation had not disposed of the entire stockpile. Over 250,000 gallons of Agent Orange and other herbicides remained on the island, their barrels continuing their slow, steady process of rotting under the tropical sun. Furthermore, the years of storing the main stockpile before the Vulcanus arrived had already created an environmental catastrophe. The ground of the storage yard, an area covering several acres, was saturated with leaked Agent Orange. The dioxin levels in the soil were astronomical. The island itself had become another hotspot, a toxic twin to the air bases at Bien Hoa and Da Nang. Before the military could even deal with the remaining barrels, they had to launch a massive hazardous cleanup of the island's own soil, scraping up thousands of tons of contaminated coral and dirt, which was then sealed in yet more barrels. They had created a concentrated solid form of the poison with nowhere to go. The military's ultimate high-tech solution arrived in the 1980s, the Johnston Atoll Chemical Agent Disposal System, or JACADS. It was a billion-dollar state-of-the-art incineration facility, a monument of engineering designed to be the final answer to America's chemical weapons problem. Its primary mission was to destroy the massive stockpiles of nerve gas and mustard gas that had been stored on the island for decades. But it was also the designated endgame for the remaining Agent Orange residue and the tons of contaminated soil. Pitched to the world as a foolproof, environmentally sealed system, the reality of JACADS was far different. For its entire operational life, from 1990 to 2000, the plant was a catalog of failures. It was plagued by equipment malfunctions, pipeline cracks, and repeated emergency shutdowns. And most terrifyingly, it was plagued by leaks. There were dozens of unplanned releases, puffs of aerosolized nerve agent, spills of toxic sludge, and billowing clouds of improperly incinerated byproducts that rained down on the island and the thousands of American contract workers who lived there. The very machine built to destroy the poison was itself becoming a source of new, uncontrolled contamination. But because this was all happening on a tiny, secure military base, thousands of miles from the nearest civilian, these repeated failures were deemed an acceptable risk. Uncomfortable quote from a fictionalized but representative environmental safety audit of the JACADS facility, circa 1995. Subject: Review of unscheduled venting incidents. The facility has experienced multiple unplanned atmospheric releases of agent byproducts during the reporting period, exceeding original safety projections. While these events constitute a technical breach of protocol, our risk assessment modeling indicates that the remote location of the atoll and the prevailing trade winds ensure that any resulting plume is rapidly diluted to negligible concentrations over the open ocean. Given the lack of approximate civilian population, the long-term human health risk is considered minimal. The operational imperative to complete the demilitarization mission on schedule justifies the acceptance of these low-probability, low-consequence excursions. Low-consequence excursions. A leak of incinerated nerve gas is a low-consequence event only if you decide that the lives of the contract workers on the island don't have the same value as lives on the mainland. This was the cold logic of the sacrifice zone. Johnston Atoll and the people sent to work there were deemed expendable in the service of a national security mission. When the last chemical weapon was finally destroyed and JACADS was dismantled in the early 2000s, the U.S. government spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a cleanup and declared the island safe. It was then turned over to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, rebranded as a pristine nature refuge. But this, too, is a fiction. The island is a ghost. It is permanently off-limits to the public. The soil is still contaminated. The groundwater is still poisoned. Fishing in its beautiful turquoise lagoon is forbidden. The tons of dioxin-laced soil scraped up decades ago are still there, buried in a sealed landfill, a toxic tumor that can never be removed. Johnston Atoll is the perfect, tragic symbol for the entire philosophy behind the Agent Orange cover-up. It is the physical manifestation of out of sight, out of mind. It proves that you cannot truly destroy a poison so persistent. You can only move it. You can only concentrate it. You can only hide it in a place you declare worthless. The island is a national sacrifice zone, a piece of the planet intentionally and permanently poisoned for political convenience. It stands today as a silent, sun-bleached monument, a beautiful tomb that holds the secrets of a chemical war, and a stark warning that when you try to bury your poison, you often end up burying a piece of the world along with it. The tomb on Johnston Atoll, silent and sealed, is the final resting place for the physical chemical. But the story's true conclusion, its dark moral, is found in the open, unpunished world of the men who created it, sold it, and deployed it. As the decades passed, a final, chilling balance sheet was drawn up. On one side of the ledger, millions of lives in Vietnam shattered by cancer, poverty, and birth defects. Hundreds of thousands of American veterans and their families fighting a relentless battle with disease and a government that betrayed them. An ecosystem scarred for a century. And on the other side of the ledger, absolutely no one. Not a single government official, from the presidents who authorized the program to the secretaries of defense who championed it to the generals who executed it, was ever held accountable. They retired with full honors. They collected their pensions. They wrote their memoirs in which the chemical war was either a tragic but necessary footnote or was not mentioned at all. Robert McNamara, the architect of the escalation, expressed regret for the war's errors in his old age, but never for the specific, calculated decision to poison the landscape. There were no tribunals, no sanctions, no censures. Not a single corporate executive from Dow or Monsanto who oversaw the production of a deliberately contaminated, more profitable poison ever faced a criminal charge. They were not tried for negligent homicide or for conspiracy to defraud the government. They were celebrated as captains of industry, philanthropists, and pillars of their communities. They retired to their yachts and their country clubs, their fortunes built in part on the suffering that their products had caused. The corporations themselves, Dow and Monsanto, walked away virtually unscathed. The 1984 class action settlement, the supposed moment of reckoning, was a rounding error on their balance sheets, a minor cost of doing business. Crucially, they never had to admit guilt. They went on to become larger, richer, and more powerful global entities, their stock prices climbing ever upward. Agent Orange, for them, was not a moral stain. It was just another successful government contract from a long-gone era. The system had worked perfectly, shielding every powerful actor from any meaningful consequence, while leaving the victims to absorb the entire cost. This complete systemic failure of accountability was not an accident. It was the intended result of a series of deliberate choices made over decades. It was a lesson, learned and internalized by the powerful, a lesson that has echoed ever since. This is the ultimate uncomfortable reality of the Agent Orange scandal. Its most toxic and enduring legacy is not the dioxin in the soil of Vietnam, but the playbook it created, the field-tested step-by-step guide for profiting from catastrophe and getting away with it. Step 1. Deny everything. Control your internal data and use attorney-client privilege to keep your secrets buried. Step 2. Manufacture doubt. When independent science emerges that threatens you, don't try to refute it. Fund your own science to contradict it. Create an expert versus expert debate that leaves the public confused and policymakers paralyzed. Step 3. Attack the messenger. Brand independent scientists as alarmists, journalists as propagandists, and victims as greedy malcontents. Step 4. Wrap yourself in the flag. Claim that your actions, however harmful, were done in the service of a greater national or economic good. And the final, most important step: never admit guilt. Settle the lawsuits, pay the fines, but never, ever concede the central point, because an admission of guilt creates a legal precedent, while a no-fault settlement is just the price of making a problem go away. This is the Agent Orange playbook, and once it was written, it became the gospel for corporate malfeasance everywhere. It was used by the tobacco industry to deny the link between smoking and cancer for 50 years. It was used by the asbestos industry to hide the truth about mesothelioma. It has been used by the fossil fuel industry to obscure the science of climate change, and by pharmaceutical companies to deflect blame for the opioid crisis. The Agent Orange scandal was the template. It was the dress rehearsal that proved you could poison millions, lie about it for decades, and not only survive, but thrive. It normalized a level of corporate and governmental cynicism that has since become standard operating procedure. A poison that has leached from the jungles of Southeast Asia into the very bloodstream of our modern world. And so the story ends where it began, with a promise of a clean technological solution that delivered a dirty, unending tragedy. The spraying stopped, the lawsuits were settled, the barrels were burned. But the consequences remain, unresolved. The dioxin still sleeps in the soil of the Vietnamese hotspots, a debt that is still being paid by the unborn. The veterans' illnesses are still debated in the sterile language of epidemiological studies. And most importantly, the playbook for profiting from ecocide remains open in corporate boardrooms around the world. While this narrative has been synthesized to reveal the true paradoxes of power, the history is painfully real. The events, the chemicals, and the victims are not fiction. Official histories written by the powerful are rarely complete. They are designed to create a sense of resolution, of lessons learned. But the uncomfortable reality is that the most important lesson learned from the Agent Orange scandal may have been learned by the perpetrators, that with enough power, money, and cynicism, you can get away with anything. I encourage you to look deeper into this story. Research the Bionetics study, the Zumwalt family, the hotspots of Bien Hoa. Don't let this history be forgotten. Share what you find. And that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.